Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our and thank you and welcome to our joining the Congestion Revenue Rights Stakeholder Meeting. My name is Brenda Marquez, and I'll be helping facilitate today's meeting. As I like to start, I would like to acknowledge Hillary, our lead policy developer and today's main presenter, who's on site, along with my colleague, Christina Guimera, who's also on site supporting the meeting. Thank you both for being there in person. Today's discussion, we will cover key items, the issue paper, straw proposal on product definition that was published on December 12, 2025. And then second, the forthcoming of the issue paper of resource adequacy and auction efficiency, which was also currently being finalized. That was also separately sent on a separate notice for the webpage. So we also appreciate everyone's engagement for these important policy enhancements. On the next slide, for housekeeping, we will dive in for just a few housekeeping reminders as this call is being recorded and the recording will be posted to the initiative webpage. All participants are muted, but we'll be opening the designated Q&A session during the meeting, and you'll be able to raise your hand to ask a question. If you are just dialed in only through your mobile phone device, you only have to use *3 to be added to the question queue. Also, please ensure to use your full name and organization name when speaking. This will allow us to know who has a question and who's representing the question. If you do run into technical issues, please message us into the chat and our team will assist. We also have the transparency viewer available and the closed captioning for those who are following along and listening to us. The slides for today's meeting will be available in the next few minutes, so we will make sure that gets posted and sent out to everyone, but we'll be sharing the most up-to-date slides at this time. Next slide. We do have a process that we are putting in place within the working group phase. We do post materials up to less than 2 days prior to meetings. Right now, we are focusing on the proposal development phase of this initiative, so we plan to post 1 week prior to the stakeholder meeting, as well as the presentations that are posted 2 days prior. We do apologize that this one wasn't posted 2 days prior, but we did provide that agenda last week, reflecting our agenda topics for today's meeting. Next slide. Before we dive into material, I want to briefly highlight the principles of the guide of the policy initiatives and stakeholder process. We just launched this new visual that walks us through the stakeholder process. It starts with initiate, scope, and develop, and decide and implement. A few key principles are shown on the stakeholder website that include the ISO's market designs, policy, and infrastructure planning. So these approach is also grounded with the 3 core principles of inclusivity, transparency, and trust. For more information on details of this process works, you could also find on the stakeholder process guide. And currently we are in the develop phase of this initiative. And now with that being said, let's get started, and I'll begin with a brief introduction and turn it over to Hillary, our lead policy developer and today's main speaker, who will walk through the materials on product definition and provide an overview on the concepts that were included in a forthcoming issue with the resource adequacy and auction efficiency as well. And then go back to one slide. So we do plan to take a few breaks throughout the day. You'll hear us when we do that. At the same time, we have Dinesh who has his topics, but Kelly will be covering those topics listed below. And then we also have Partha Madhakar, who is also the principal of resource adequacy, who is joining us as well shortly. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Brenda. Good morning, everybody. This is Hillary Staver, and let's get into this. As Brenda mentioned, we're going to be covering all 3 of the main topic areas in this initiative that were collectively covered by the 2 papers that we published in December and January last week. And I have left, as Brenda noted, Dinesh was originally going to cover product definition for us. Unfortunately, he is under the weather and can't be with us this morning. So I'm going to cover that material, but I wanted to leave his name there because just to emphasize, he's been leading this area. So if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to all of us. So without further ado, let's get into first, just take a moment and talk about what we're here to do today. This is our first meeting in this initiative since we met in September last year for the final meeting of the scoping phase. So since then, we published in December the updated discussion paper that had the final product of the scoping phase, the problem statements and goals. And since then, we've published the 2 papers that kick off the policy development phase of this initiative, the issue paper and straw proposal on product definition in December, and then last week, the issue paper on revenue adequacy and auction efficiency enhancements. So today, we're going to go through both of those areas, really looking forward to all of the discussion and hearing your feedback on these ideas. What we're trying to do here today, the main goal, apart from the straw proposal, is on the issue paper side to go back and look at all of the policy ideas that were raised in the working group discussions so far. Because in the course of talking through what we wanted to achieve in this initiative and articulating the problem statements, we heard a lot of ideas for specific policy proposals. And so in the issue paper area here, we've kind of compiled all those now that it's time to start talking about specific policy ideas. And then of course we have the straw proposal, which is a bit more concrete. We're going to be going through that today, as well as laying the foundation for straw proposals in the other areas later in the year. So this is just a quick recap of what I just reviewed. We wrapped up the scoping phase in December. We have the papers out to kick off the policy development phase, and we're going to be discussing all of that today and in preparation as well for written comments being submitted on the 4th. So we're looking forward to hearing your written feedback as well as the discussion today. In terms of next steps for the policy development phase, we'll come back to this at the end, but just as a quick overview, the main thing that I wanted to emphasize here is that this year we're going to be looking at policy development in all 3 of these areas in parallel. So we already have a straw proposal on product definition released. Of course, we're going to talk about that today. We are also going to be working towards, in the first half of this year, straw proposals in these other 2 areas. And so these 3 areas that we have highlighted here, these are not distinct tracks. We're going to be considering them all in parallel, but we may come out with straw proposals on slightly different timelines for some of these areas, depending on how quickly the discussion coalesces. So that concludes the overview. Before we get started on product definition, does anybody have thoughts or questions about the stage we're in now or the process going forward, or anything kind of at an overall level before we dive in?
I'm not seeing any hands in the room. Brenda, do you see any hands online?
No hands.
Okay. Well, let's get started with our morning session then. We are going to talk about the December 12th paper that covered issue paper and straw proposal topics related to product definition. So first, we're going to talk about time of use periods, and the overall framing for this section, as captured in problem statement 5 coming out of the scoping phase, was the question of whether we can evolve the definition of the CRR product in any way that will help that product better match evolving hedging needs since those definitions were last updated. And as we were talking through this in the scoping phase, one of the topics that came up the most clearly was the idea that the current time of use periods that we use for CRR product definition may no longer match hedging needs as well as they did when those definitions were adopted. We currently have 2 CRR products, on peak hour ending 7 to 22 and off peak 23 to 7, including Sundays. But the discussion revealed that since those definitions were adopted, there's been a lot of change on the grid, including a lot of evolution in the resource mix, and with that evolution in congestion patterns, and therefore hedging needs. So this topic was focused on, are there changes we can make to the time of use periods by which we define CRR products that will allow them to be more effective hedging tools for participants in the CRR market? There was a lot of discussion on this in the scoping phase. So just as a quick recap, we had over 20 stakeholders talking about this in one way or another. A lot of it was around how to define an updated time of use period. We had some stakeholders who didn't see this as the top priority, but no one who saw a strong risk or was strongly opposed to revisiting the time of use periods. So this was one reason why we were able to proceed straight to a straw proposal. It seemed like there was some value and priority on this for a lot of stakeholders in the scoping phase. We also had presentations on this from two of our stakeholders, Department of Water Resources and Vistra, at meetings during the scoping phase. And of course, I should have noted this up front, but if there's anyone here who is joining us now at the beginning of policy development and was not here during the scoping phase, that record is all on the initiative webpage, recordings, materials. So if you would like to go back and look at these presentations, those are all available. But this is just a quick recap for anyone who may be joining us here now. And so after taking all that into account and thinking about how we can best distill it into a first cut at a proposed update, this is what came out in the straw proposal. So what has been proposed there is we are going to redefine the time of use periods to have peak be hour ending 7 to 9. Then we're going to have hour ending 18 to 22. And then we're going to have a midday period, hour ending 10 to 17, and maintain the off-peak product as it is today. So we would be splitting the current on-peak period into two products and maintaining the off-peak as it is. This is a graphical representation on the next two slides here of what we have today versus what we are proposing. So here you can see the current off-peak and on-peak periods highlighted in orange and dark blue respectively. And this is we're looking at Monday through Saturday here. So you can see on the y-axis, what we've got there is congestion charges in millions. And you can see that the time of use periods are designed to capture the change in that congestion that you see over the course of the day. But if we move to the next slide, what we've got in gray there that was formerly part of the on-peak period is now going to be a separate on-peak period, what we're calling peak, that will capture those kind of shoulder hours in the morning and in the evening. And we will have a midday peak product in the navy blue there that covers the hours of 10 to 17 when we've got peak solar production on the grid. So the idea here, based on what we were hearing in the working group conversations, is there would be some value on having a separate additional product that addresses the evening peak and the morning peak as well, these hours of relatively high congestion, but outside of the main solar production hours, and then having a separate category or a separate time period for the midday. I'll pause there. I see we have one question. I think this is a good place to pause and take feedback.
Looks like we have a hand raised online from Michael Kramick. Go ahead, Michael.
Energy, can you hear me?
It's a little low. Let me see if I can raise the volume.
Is that any better?
Yeah.
It is.
So just a one, I guess, general comment, because we were dealing with this actually in ERCOT right now, because they're having a similar discussion about creating a new type of peak product. One of the things that I think CAISO should think about is how do you transition from the current product to the new product? There may be longer term CRRs out there, or just think about as you're moving forward this, that transition. Do you keep the current product definition and just add this as a new? Does the current definition go away? I think, and how is that transition happen? Because I think in ERCOT, we've had some kind of stumbling blocks around that issue. You would think it might be simple, but nothing is ever simple. So just something to think about as you move the proposal forward. But I think from my perspective, this is a good starting point for sure. So thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a great point. We will have to address the transition if we move forward with this. One of the things that not changing the off-peak product will do is require a little bit less of a transition in the sense that off-peak CRRs would not be affected by this change. So we would only have to address the transition in current on-peak CRRs. But nonetheless, it's a great point. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to the next hand online, we have a hand raised in the room from Steve Keen. Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, Steve Keen from Edison. A couple of questions just to see, can you present information like on this slide, but by season, so that we can see what the differences are between the 4 seasons? The other thing is, since a lot of this I think is aimed at solar, and the solar tends to be concentrated in certain areas, did you do any breakdown of where the congestion is? Just to see, obviously most of the congestion is during those on-peak hours, but what I'm interested in here is that congestion coming from the solar, or is it, within the load areas?
Thank you. I have a couple thoughts in response to that. First of all, the seasonality question. Can you walk me through your thinking there a little bit? Would you see some value in getting more detail on the seasonal level?
I'm not sure that there's going to be any difference. It's just I know that a lot of the congestion is driven by solar, especially in the spring and early summer periods where there's not a lot of demand and there's a lot of solar. I'm just thinking there, I just like to see how different it is between the different time periods. I could see where there may be a big difference between what's happening in the summer then, as opposed to what's happening, say, in the fall or the winter. I was just hoping to see if any indication. The fact that we do CRRs on a even in the long term on a seasonal basis, quarterly basis, I think that might help people know, what they were going to buy or what they were going to look for.
I see. Thank you. Also, on the point about location, I think maybe one thing that's relevant here, the reason that we're showing this in total congestion revenue on these slides is when we were thinking about this, even though to your point, one of the major things that has happened on the grid since we adopted these definitions is the increase in solar, and that has driven a lot of change in congestion patterns. We want these designs to be not to be designed around any particular technology, but to be reflective of changes in congestion patterns sort of system-wide across the day. So that's why we've displayed it this way here. And in terms of the location, let me think about that. I'll think about that. I take your point.
Yeah, that's fine. I realize this isn't necessarily your section, so.
We do have Partha who may like to add. Hillary, is that okay? Go ahead, Partha.
Yes. Feel free, please.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Really appreciate that. And I would note as well, Kyle Pelham might want to weigh in too. We have some analysis, I believe, in our straw proposal, which he can describe some of the nuances about how we looked at seasonal changes. So if Kyle Pelham's on the line, it might be good to call on him. But if not, Steve, I'd recommend reviewing some of that data. and agree that that's not sufficient. I think that we're obviously looking to try to make sure that the information we provide is good and actionable for you all to understand, sort of based on sort of your hedging needs. Is this the right level of granularity? We certainly could provide the same sort of data, but if what we provide to date isn't sufficient, yeah, we'd certainly be happy to hear more about what data would be helpful. So yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Stacy, if we could please unmute Kyle next to speak on this as well.
Hey, good morning, everybody. If you can hear me, my name is Kyle Pelham. As Partha just introduced me, I was hands-on on kind of looking at the data behind this material today. And to answer the question around seasonality, we did include a few charts broken down just by the CRR seasons, so quarterly breakdowns of the same view that you're seeing here, broken out by year. I think we have the 4 seasons for each year that we're seeing here, just to kind of add some more data points. And then looking around the location aspect of it, one thing we did as part of our exploratory analysis to get to this point was to look at a number of things. First one being congestion charges by direction, by resource, by location, as well as variability of MCC. So think of just like standard deviation for a given hour of MCC across the DLAPs and trading hubs. And what we found in summary is that this congestion pattern that we see here, right, this is the kind of the central midday clump that we see on the page, really kind of regardless of where you're on the grid, there is some representation across these hours. Whether if you're in Southern California, you'll see negative MCC. If you're in Northern California, you'll see positive, and then anywhere in between, you might see some variation of that. But for the most part, the concentrations of like net congestion rent are across these hours, and most of the variability across MCC, kind of regardless of location, is also concentrated around these hours. So we can definitely work to
Thank you, Kyle.
Next, we have Jason Edwards.
You might be double muted if you're trying to speak right now, Jason.
I don't see any audio coming in from his end, so let's go to Doug Boccione first, and then I'll work with Jason to see his audio disconnected.
This is Doug Boccione with Flint Resource Consultants for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I'm wondering if you looked at the data for the weekend off-peak hours. I'm thinking about the midday, the same hours that you show as the midday peak time during the non-holiday weekdays, or non-holiday Monday through Saturday. If you were to include all the days in that period, in that TOU period, how would things look? I mean, it's not obvious to me that it's maintaining the off-peak the same as it is today makes sense. If a key driver of this change is the solar production and hedging that output from solar resources.
So I'll go to Kyle next, but just to run that back, Doug, your point being that maybe it would make sense to include Sunday in the on-peak as we're transitioning here and split that as well into three TOU periods?
Include it in the midday peak, but not the peak.
Ah, I see.
So you would, that would require a change to the off-peak. I know this proposal wouldn't change the off-peak, but and I'm not saying it should be done that way. I'm saying, could you look at it? Because I mean, and it may be that it actually makes sense to have it be part of the off peak because, maybe on those days the congestion's in a different direction than during the Monday through Saturday, but the solar production doesn't know that it's Saturday, or Sunday or a holiday. And I don't know, I just wonder if we still, I mean, we already have this problem today, but this would partially address the concern, but I wonder if it would be better to consider the midday peak periods to be every day.
So if we were going to test that on Sunday, for example, what it would look like is to have the midday peak 10 to 17 and then an off-peak definition of all other hours for Sunday or for the off-peak days in general.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying.
So, I mean, it's just a different, I think it would be at least worth looking at. I'm not saying it's better than this. I'm just curious.
I see we've got a couple other hands here. Kyle, I want to make sure I don't miss. Is there anything you wanted to weigh in on with that?
Sure. Yeah. So removing off peak, from this graph was just to kind of, highlight, since peak is kind of the highlight of this discussion, we just wanted to focus in on that. But yeah, we can definitely look into, how off peak, can better address the solar peak. And just kind of from my recollection of going through that, as you would expect, or as you said, right, the solar doesn't know it's the weekend, and we still see strong, strong shape that we see here, also on the weekends when it comes to solar. So we can definitely, talk about that more. But yeah, hear you there.
Thanks.
Thank you, Doug.
Next.
So Partha wants to add something really quick. Hillary, yeah.
Maybe just to add that too, this was, I think, Doug, your question really was something that we had raised up in the straw proposal, and it really was sort of a question. I really think it comes down to, partly we can provide more analysis, but partly it's sort of a matter of the hedging needs and risks. And my guess is that participants have a better sense about, particularly on the Sunday question, whether or not it needs to be, if there's a high value to redefining that in some sense. And I think the way at least I was thinking about it was probably having all the days, including Sunday, having those same product definitions and shapes, but there might be some justification to having something different. But to a degree that you or others feel like, hey, when we see the congestion patterns for our resource, there would be a different definition, particularly based on Sunday. We'd love to have that feedback if it's an important topic to include. So
yeah, and maybe if I could just add that, I mean, I think we did this like weekday weekend originally way back when, because it sort of better aligned with some bilateral market practices. But another way to think, given the impact that the solar production has, it may not, I mean, it may make sense to have just these three buckets be the same hours every day of the week, not just for the solar, the midday peak being every day, but it may not. I really don't know. But I think you could look at the congestion patterns and get some insights about that. I was thinking you would, put all the solar hours in the midday peak. I mean, the other issue is these do change seasonally. So, it might make sense to have these be different hours for different seasons. More complicated, but not really.
Next in the queue, we have Justin Panu. Go ahead, Justin.
We certainly agree with Doug. Can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah,
Justin,
no,
can you introduce yourself? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, Justin Panu at Calpine Energy Solutions. Calpine Energy Solutions. So, you know, we certainly agree with Doug on this point. We'd like to see Sunday included in the analysis and potentially part of the reform, as you've all mentioned that, you know, Sundays are subject to patterns in solar output. So we're also interested in it.
Thank you. Next in the queue, we have Alex Jewett. Go ahead, Alex. Looks like your audio is not connected. Yeah. So we'll circle back to Alex once the, oh, there we go.
Oh, he's back. Go ahead, Alex.
Oh, okay, great. So everyone can hear, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, great. So thanks. My name is Alex Sharut. I'm from SCE. I wanted to ask a question about if you had considered how future congestion patterns may change from more additional solar, and if our ND9 really best fits into the peak or the midday peak.
Thank you. This is something that we did think about. We have a slide on that. You know, I will just jump ahead here. Oops, sorry. So we did think about that. The idea of whether some of those transition hours should be in the peak or the midday peak. So I think what you can think about is what we've put out here in the straw proposal is a starting point, and we put those hours with the new peak definition, but we're definitely interested in feedback because I think we could go in different directions on this, and if there is feedback on where those hours should be to make it best match up with hedging needs, that's feedback that we would be very interested in. So I think, to speak to your question directly, that is still a possibility, and if you have preferences between those two, that would be great to hear.
Can we unmute Alex? I think she lowered her hand. Let's do call-in user 3. Oh wait, Alex is back, sorry.
Sorry, I'm having issues with the mute. So yeah, I think on our side at SCE, we're just thinking about that, you know, it may take a few years for the new like TOU to be implemented, and by that time there may be a lot more solar and that the congestion pattern could look different, and that we're thinking that potentially, especially the end of this morning peak period, that our ND9 might be like shifting more into the midday peak.
Understood. Thank you. I'm seeing some nods in the room here as well. Okay, thank you. That's very helpful to know, and we'd love to see that in comments as well.
Thanks.
We do have call-in user 3. Please introduce yourself and your organization.
This is Nil Hatchett on behalf of ETI, and I apologize if I missed this in some of the earlier meetings, but have you guys considered a separate weekend peak product that might address some of these concerns, so you could still, then you could keep the off-peak sort of more consistent, if you will?
We did have, I apologize, I missed your very first part. I wasn't sure if that was the earlier part of this morning's meeting or the earlier meetings, but we did just have some discussion on that, where Sunday should be. And I think it sounds like that is an area for future discussion.
Thank you.
And the last one we have is Mohan Narula.
Good morning. This is Mohan Nirula with CWR. Yeah, I would like to also mention that inclusion of Sunday in the analysis would be a good idea, and including other holidays as well. That might be a good starting point for giving a proper analysis.
Thank you.
Right? Thank you.
And we do have one hand in the room from Jordan Miner. Go ahead, Jordan.
Hi, Jordan Miner, CPUC Energy Division. Could we jump back to slide 17, please? I have a follow-up question about one of your bullet points. So when your second bullet point about analysis shows these hours could be combined with the midday peak hours, if we combine the morning peak hours into the midday peak hours, so making a new product, peak product basically, is that not what CWI proposed originally a while back of a super peak product then?
Mohan, I won't speak directly for you, but I think that does at least align with the 2024 policy roadmap item on splitting the on-peak into a peak and super peak, where the third product would be only in the evening. Is that, does that align with your response to Jordan's question?
Could we please unmute Jason?
Hello there. Can folks hear me?
We can.
Oh, great. I was talking to myself a little bit a few minutes ago. Glad you couldn't hear me. It was rough. So great discussion going on here. In fact, folks have gotten to some of the key points that I wanted to bring up, so I'll just kind of drop those. But I will say that Edison has done a lot of analysis around this point, not only by way of location, but in terms also of seasonality and day of the week and stuff. And we were lucky enough to meet with CAISO modelers and go over some of this. And we had a lot of kind of meeting of the minds, and that our results were converging in kind of a large sense. But we asked a lot of these questions around, hey, Sundays that belong in there, or do we have seasonality? What's the trade-off between more TOUs and practical implementation complexity? It doesn't make sense to mix seasonality and TOUs. And from what I recall, a lot of those questions were actually thought about from the CAISO team and involved in the analysis. Maybe not all of it is here, but I recall having a great discussion with Dinesh and others, maybe a couple of weeks back, and certainly thought about it. So I think they're prepared for these comments. That's all by way of background. Now getting actually maybe to the question in front of us, the seasonality and the balance in the practicality of implementation. In our clustering analysis, and we're happy to share with folks because it's just public data that we did some clustering around. We noticed a big drop off in how we parameterize the TOUs. That is to say, if we use 2 or 3 or 4 or n number of categories. And we saw the biggest drop off at 2, meaning we would have kind of 2 categories, like an on-peak and off-peak or whatever you want to call it. But then when we moved to Q3, we noticed there's a big difference in this so-called categorical variation. And we saw an efficient point moving to 3 TOU periods. And that's what we would want. We'll certainly give it in comments, but that's what we want to kind of maybe bring up again today, because we revisited that analysis, and we think there's definitely enough meat on that bone, for want of a better term, to pursue something that is either a little bit more complex, that is to say 3 or even more TOUs, or to kind of bite the bullet and say maybe we'll have like a mixed implementation where 2 TOUs is fine for Q1, 2, and 4, but Q3, then maybe that could use some sort of different approach. Now, I'll be quiet because I talk fast and that's a lot of words, but I'm just glad folks can hear it. So I'll take questions from the gallery if you have any comments or feedback to what I've said.
Go ahead, Partha.
Maybe this is just a process question. Would you be willing to include, like, if there's a specific proposal about how you'd redefine the periods? Love to hear that. As well as if you're willing to maybe this is maybe just a suggestion. Hillary or others can weigh in if they have a different proposal. But if you're willing to maybe include that in your comments, and then maybe we could, in like a future meeting around this design, would love to have you present or share that if you'd be willing to. Yeah, I'd love to. We'd be happy to compare data, but if really you have an analysis that you feel could be impactful for other participants, sharing that more broadly, I think could be very valuable. So, yeah, thanks for your feedback. Any thoughts on that?
Parth, I appreciate your feedback. That sounds great, and we'll definitely be prepared in comments with suggestions and incremental analysis. I will say that we don't have a specific suggestion for TOU, though we're kind of circling on some stuff. We had the initial meeting with folks, and we were really counting on this workshop and feedback from other participants to get at their concerns and to use that to get us past the finish line, stay on our analysis, and to see if we have like a robust recommendation, even if it's just to support what the CAISO is giving us. Yeah, so definitely looking forward to that, but I'm also looking forward to folks' especially critical feedback. Like if there's stuff they don't think is going to work, stuff that we can take a look at, then, and we've been looking at this project for a long time. I'd like to finish it up right. So we take any and all feedback.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other hands at this time.
Thank you, everybody. I think we've got some good feedback here. We got a little bit into some of the topics that we were going to cover next, but we have a couple more slides here just to talk through some of the additional things that we considered as we were coming up with this straw proposal. So, of course, the first is the one that we have already been through, looking at those morning hours in the straw proposal. We have grouped them with the evening peak in a non-contiguous TOU, but an alternative would be to group them in with the midday peak hours, 10 to 17. So we've had some discussion on that, but to the extent that anyone else has thoughts, those are welcome. And what we're interested in, a la the last bullet point there, is which of these options, or would one of these options better align with the hedging needs that you are seeing? One thing that we haven't talked about yet is we looked at the idea of 4 products. We have currently the morning and evening peak grouped in a non-contiguous TOU period in the proposal, but another alternative would be to break them up separately and have the off-peak, a morning peak, midday solar hours, and an evening peak product. So that is something that, on the one hand, if there were different enough hedging needs in those different time periods, that could provide some more granularity on hedging ability. At the same time, that is a more complex system to implement, and it's a more complex system to participate in. So when we looked at the 2 possibilities, it seemed like 3 TOU periods might be a good starting point, but to the extent that you feel like 4 separate products would better match hedging needs, that's feedback that we would be interested in and was something that we were thinking about as we were developing this. We have also already talked a little bit about seasonality, but again, that was something that we started to look into. The initial sense was that there was little enough variability across seasons that we would start with the non-seasonal proposal that you see here. But I think what we've already heard from the discussion is it sounds like there is some interest in digging more deeply into seasonality, seasonal variation. So that is duly noted, and I think that's a useful thing to incorporate into our iteration on this proposal. And then finally, we have also already gotten a little bit into off-peak days. And as was stated earlier, we are interested in suggestions on what to do with Sunday. Part of the reason that we started with the proposal that we did to go all the way back to Michael's first question about transitions, is that it would let us keep the current structure in place. And so if an incremental change that leaves Sunday in the off-peak period would meet hedging needs, then that's a less complex transition. But it sounds like there is some interest potentially in looking more deeply at Sunday, and to the extent that that ends up being the best match, that's something we could look at. So that brings us to the end of the TOU period content. I think we've already had some good discussion on a number of these final slides here, but I'll pause for a moment. Does anybody have any other feedback, thoughts, questions? I think what I'm hearing, the theme overall here, is that there is interest in delving into more detail on a number of the variants here, the seasonality, the grouping of the hours, the placement of Sunday. If anyone has thoughts on the 3 versus 4 time periods, that hasn't come up yet, but that's welcome. So yeah, I'll pause here for feedback on the entire section.
We do have a hand raised in the room from Steve Keene. Go ahead, Steve.
Steve Keene from Edison. I just wanted to ask, I did look through, and the seasonality graphs that I asked for are actually in the issue paper and the whatever it's called. But the one thing I didn't see in there, and I'm sure you've probably done it, is a similar graph for Sundays and holidays, right? You did it for the on peak days, but I think that would be kind of, at least to my mind, that's probably the most telling as to whether Sundays should be, whether there's this peak period on Sundays or not. So if you could, if you guys could put out that same type of graph just for Sundays and holidays, so we can see if the pattern, is it flat at a low level like typical off-peak hours that we see in the other ones, or does it spike up in the middle of the day like on a normal day? I think that would be the most telling as to how to adjust that.
Thank you. And Kyle, do you have anything you'd like to say on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that's a very feasible thing we can put together. As of now, we kind of have everything. Where the hours where the hours that are part of the on peak, there's just a flag that we just have to do the inverse of to get that chart. So that should be very doable. So yeah, thanks for the feedback.
Thanks. Next in the queue, we have Mohan Nirula online. Go ahead, Mohan.
Yeah, Mohan Nirula with CDWR. If you can go back to slide number 17. Oh, the one before that, I think it was 16, showing the new proposal chart. Yeah. So quick observation here for the peak period from 7 through 9 and 18 through 22. If you look at the morning peak, 7 through 9, congestion seems to be increasing. And then evening peak now, congestion, the trend seems to be going down. So does this mean that the congestion is reversing there? And would the same CRR address congestion in both directions? So I was just thinking about that based on the chart here. Or maybe we should have a separate super peak that, as CDWR proposed, which would be 18 through 22, which has a different direction of congestion than the morning peak. Just a quick observation. So
I take your point, and if I'm hearing you right, so your main priority when looking at where some of these hours should go is the directionality of the congestion exposure in different time periods, and making sure that you have different periods that align to the direction changes.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And Steve, is that an old hand or do you have another question? Okay. I'm not seeing any other hands in the room or online.
Okay. Well, let's see. We're running a little bit ahead of schedule. So we had originally started we were going to have a 10-minute break. Why don't we move into our next topic and we can plan to take our break at 10:30. So now we'll talk about the second major topic covered in the December 12th paper, which is how storage interacts with the CRR definitions, and specifically the use of storage as an eligible sink. To go through some background on this, first of all, this topic was affected by the CRR policy updates that were adopted in 2018 and implemented in 2019, specifically the Track 1A changes in which storage resources became ineligible as a sink. And at the time, there was a very different overall role and place for storage on the grid. At the time, there were about 500 megawatts. This was in 2020, a little bit after implementation. Today, we are at over 10x that. So to the extent that storage has a hedging need for charging, that is something that has become applicable to a much larger amount of capacity since this issue was last revisited. So the core of the concern that we heard in the discussions in the scoping phase is that storage resources, especially standalone storage, may be unable to hedge for congestion risk related to charging or discharging energy if they cannot nominate storage as an eligible sink in the auction process. And the concern was that to the extent that hedging is more difficult, then that also is carried forward in prices and the role of storage in comparison to other resources. So this was something that we had a good bit of discussion on in the scoping phase. We've got a summary here. We heard from Vistra presenting on it. We heard a couple different specific ideas around this. Some feedback on the nuances around what types of storage should be able to qualify as a sink. We had then also on the last bullet there, we had some feedback around making storage charging an eligible load and sink in the allocation process. And another stakeholder saying if we were going to do that, recognizing that that would involve changes to the seasonal eligible quantity by which it is determined how much an eligible participant can nominate in the allocation process. So we're gonna talk through both of these issues, the storage as an eligible sink node and also storage as load in the allocation. First of all, storage as a sink. So the idea here was that currently storage cannot hedge charging related congestion risk via CRRs as expressed in the scoping phase because of this ineligibility for them to serve as an eligible sink in the auction process. And so the goal of taking this up based on what we heard in those conversations is to improve the ability of storage resources to allow for storage charging hedging capability while inhibiting opportunistic arbitrage that does not improve market efficiency. So we've seen a lot more storage come onto the grid. There's a lot more charging energy need now, and this was recognized as something that was not really an issue when this topic was considered in 2018. So what we have proposed in the straw proposal is to include standalone storage as an auction sink with limitations. Storage cannot be a source and sink with other resources, and for the time being, it will remain ineligible for the allocation, as the allocation process is designed for load-serving entities. We had some discussion, as with the previous section. We've got some slides here on different elements that we considered as we were developing the straw proposal. So one thing we looked at is, should co-located and hybrid storage be eligible sinks as well, in addition to standalone? And so that is something that for now the proposal is standalone, but we're interested in feedback. If they should be, given that these resources have charging resources at the site with them, what limitations, if any, should be included on their eligibility. And so that's something that we're interested in hearing feedback on. If any of you have thoughts on standalone versus co-located and hybrid. But the straw proposal, as we have put it out now, is that this would be limited to standalone storage. And so it would become an eligible sink in the auction process available for nomination, which is a change from the 1A restrictions adopted in 2019. See, I think a hand in the room. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Hillary. This is Chris Devon with Calpine. Could you just maybe explain a little bit more what you are stating here on inhibiting opportunistic arbitrage that does not improve market efficiency? And perhaps this was discussed in the prior stakeholder meetings, and I may have missed that, but it's just not quite clear to me exactly what the intent of that part of this goal is.
Yeah, I can speak to that. Oh, actually, I see Partha has a hand up. Go for it.
Go for it, Hillary. I'm happy to weigh in after if needs.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Part of what we're recognizing there is that there is a lot of flexibility in storage. There's can be rapid transition between charging and discharging. And so to the extent that there are constraints on when charging can happen, we want to try and support hedging that risk, but we want to make sure that the changes that we are making on the CRR side are also taking into account ability to manage that congestion risk in other ways. Partha?
So in other words, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead if you want to add something, Partha.
Oh, sure. I think it was just really, obviously the limitations in terms of which sources and things could be traded was put in place for a reason. And that, like, we're obviously, obviously part of the proposal here is to, based on the need to loosen some of those restrictions that were put in place during our previous initiative. But we're wanting to make sure that we're not creating sort of additional risks in terms of the ability to arbitrage. That's what that language is really trying to address, was sort of the, the trade-off there, and to make sure that we're striking the right balance. But yeah, maybe.
I see. So Partha, sorry to interrupt. So in like other words, you're just trying to avoid creating a situation where a storage owner could, take advantage of these new CRRs in a way to create additional revenue that was really just for the simple fact of avoiding the congestion or creating congestion, to put more simply.
Yeah, that's right. Or other market participants, whoever's able to purchase CRRs from these locations in the auction. I think that's probably yeah.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Partha. That I'm filling in this morning, so you had the more correct answer. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Next in the queue, we have a hand online from someone from APN Way. Please state your name and affiliation before speaking.
Energy Partners, and I just wanted to throw out.
Sorry, we didn't catch your name. Could you repeat your name, please?
It's Abram.
Thanks.
I did want to suggest to broaden this discussion a little bit, because I do think for physical asset players, whether it's a wind plant or a generator that's trying to hedge, they would benefit from additional sinks that aren't necessarily load zones. And, I think forcing all the CRRs to sink at load zones, which aren't consistent over time, depending on weather patterns, actually has resulted in greater modeling differences between the CRR market and the day-ahead market, that it's contributing to some of the problems that we're seeing, whether it's with underfunding or things like that. Often a generator, say a solar resource or a wind resource in the Southwest, may not have a hedge, but want to mitigate their basis risk. And they want to basically be able to get out of the zone that they're in. And, it might make sense to identify additional, whether it's 500 kV nodes or additional trading hubs at different locations on the grid that would allow more hedging opportunities around the points that are available on the grid. I do think that having batteries be able to, having batteries be able to hedge themselves is really critical, obviously, and I appreciate that California is doing it. But part of the review of the track 1A and 1B should be to look at this question of whether some additional nodes would be useful from a hedging standpoint. And it doesn't necessarily mean putting all of the generating units back in as sources, but it would actually better match the physical flows to have CRRs go from fixed points on the grid to other fixed points on the grid, rather than having CRRs go from fixed points on the grid to points like load aggregates that change from day to day or hour to hour, depending on the weather. This is a point we made in our comments earlier.
Yes, I was going to say, I recognize from the scoping phase. I think I'll note that looking at the eligible sources and sinks, we have a specific instance here in this proposal, but I think that topic in the afternoon, we're going to get into revenue and inadequacy and auction efficiency topics. And I think the fact that we're considering this particular change here is not definitively to the exclusion of any other possible changes there. But I take your point that you're interested in something broader than the specific instance we're looking at here. And maybe we can get to that more in the afternoon.
Yeah, I think it goes to the question of where there are hedges, and I'd encourage companies to do have physical assets that they need to hedge, to ask their asset management teams if they would benefit from additional sources, and then make sure to include those in comments on February 4th.
I'll second that. It would be helpful feedback. We've got a couple questions. Well, actually, I'll let you manage, Christina.
Oh, thanks. So Steve has had his hand up, and then we'll go to Chris after.
Steve Keen, Edison. On the last set there, storage charging remains ineligible for allocation. Allocated CRRs are for load serving entities. What if a load serving entity in the allocation process wanted to direct, some of its allocation to getting a CRR to its storage facility? Would they have, basically, do they have to wait till the auction to do that and then pay for it? Or is the prohibition there just against the storage requesting it, or the storage counting as a load to be able to get some of the allocation?
That second scenario there, we're going to talk about that in a minute. It is more the former. And so am I hearing you right? The scenario you're thinking about is if, say, basically an LSE is managing the congestion risk associated with charging a battery resource that they have under contract or own.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying. That's something I think, so that would already be accounted for partially in the structure of the nomination process. as I understand it. But I think if that is something, if there's feedback from allocation participants on the call here today who feel that they are not able to do that sufficiently under the current structure of the nomination process, then that would be useful feedback.
Thanks.
Thank you. So next we have Chris, and then afterwards we'll go to Jordan Minor.
Hi again, Chris Devin with Calpine. I just wanted to provide some support for the idea of looking at additional points to add back in as think for the different CRR options. I think Calpine would be interested, particularly in going from generation nodes to the trading hubs. That's obviously a big source of bilateral contracting, and currently can only really be hedged through other types of financial products like on ICE. And I think we would support at least consideration of some of the other things that Appian was noting as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Jordan. Go ahead, Jordan.
Hello, Jordan Minor, CPUC. So I've been trying to think through the storage to sink proposal. So could you guys provide an example of when a standalone storage resource would need a hedging instrument if they are dependent on the grid for charging? So the premise of this question is, what LNP differences are they hedging here? Just because, the whole idea back to CRIs is you're hedging between 2 points, but if it's just the same point, what's the hedge there?
So you're thinking you would like a scenario on the use case here?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
Would it be useful, I think, is that something that would be useful to include maybe in an iteration of the straw proposal, some examples of how this might be applied?
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay. I think that that's something we can take back for future iteration. Thank you. And does anyone else, Partha or anyone else on the CAISO side, want to weigh in there?
I don't see anyone from ISO. Oh, go ahead, Partha.
I would say nothing on my part. Yeah, I appreciate the comment, Jordan.
Next in the queue. Yep, go ahead, Brenda.
Eric Little, I think he's from Cal CCA, just to confirm that. And then we do have a few folks after that. Go ahead, Eric.
CCA. So on the issue of eligible sinks, 3682 of the tariff states that the load eligible for sinks is at the default lapse, with one exception, and that exception is for pump storage hydro. Pump storage hydro that's not a participating node participating load can get that. I'm not seeing a difference between any other storage resource and pump storage hydro, frankly. And so when it comes to whether or not you should be able to sink in the allocation process to storage, I think the answer is we should be able to, but the current tariff does not allow that. So no real comments on whether or not it should be included in the auction process, but definitely think that the allocation process should be clarified to allow sinks at storage resources. The truth of the matter is that as we move forward with renewable goals, we're going to have more and more situations where the contract from a load serving entity is with a generator and with a storage device. And at some points in the day, it's going to be going from generation to the storage device and then from the storage device to load. You need to be able to hedge the congestion risk between both of those points. And those are going to change throughout the day, which is helped by the changes in TOU periods that you're talking about here to be able to get that congestion between those 2 points correct. So like I said, not really any comments on whether or not you include it within the auction process. We'll have to think about that a bit more, but opening up in the allocation process is something that absolutely should happen. Thanks.
So Eric, can I run part of that back? Did I hear it right, that you're focusing on a scenario in the future where there are actually two paths? There's a generation resource, and then there's a standalone storage resource at a different location, and then you have the load point. And you are thinking about instances where an LSC will need to be charging the storage resource from the generation resource at a different location, hedging that for charging, and then also hedging the storage to load location.
Maybe unmute Eric just to respond. If Eric, you want to respond, feel free to raise your hand. If not, we'll move on. Okay, he's back. Let's unmute him.
Yeah, you have it correct, Hillary. That's exactly what I'm worried about. And like I say, they probably happen during different periods of the day, right? My risk of congestion in the middle of the day is between the solar resource and the storage resource. My risk at the net peak period, which is the evening, is going to be between the battery and the load. So being able to hedge both of those legs for the congestion risk that happens, because it's going to be the cumulative total that my customer is ultimately going to pay through contracts, through settlements, through all of those types of things, that would be the ideal situation, is to be able to hedge both of those risks. Hope that helps.
Understood. Yes, thank you.
We do. Are there any questions in the room? I can't tell. No.
I'm not seeing any hands raised in the room at this moment.
Okay, we'll move on to APN Way. I think that was Abram. Let's go ahead and unmute him. Go ahead. Is that Abram?
It's Abram. Yeah.
Abram.
Thank you. I just have a really quick comment in response to the gentleman from the CPUC and also to Eric. I think Eric is exactly right about the logic here. It's important for non-discrimination that entities that have battery resources that are not load-serving entities can participate on in equal footing. And so if they're allocated CRRs, they should also be auctioned CRRs. I'm not suggesting that Eric was saying that they shouldn't be, only that he didn't offer that as a corollary. And the other point would be, I think Vistra during the policy development phase presented a pretty compelling business case for why, as owners of battery storage, they need to be able to hedge or use the battery locations as sinks. And Hillary, maybe you could pass along a link to that slide deck, or Partha.
Okay, I'll find that slide deck for you and pass it over. But go ahead, Hillary or Partha.
I was just going to note, if anyone else is interested in that, we do have that available on the initiative webpage. But thank you, Abram.
Next we have Doug Boccioni. Let's go ahead and unmute him.
Hi, Doug Boccioni for BAMX. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Jordan's point and this follow-up discussion. I do think it's worth having a little more discussion about the business case for why this product is needed. I remember when the MSC discussed this a long time ago. Their point was, if you're grid charging, you're charging at that point and you're discharging at the same point. So what's the congestion exposure? And I believe that the CPUC has a requirement as part of their slice of day construct that if you have a standalone storage resource, you have to identify a resource for a source of energy for charging. So I could see in that scenario where an entity might have a source that's at a different location from the storage resource. Maybe it's a similar thing for someone who isn't subject to that requirement, but I'd like more information sort of justifying the need for this product, because my concern is that this, if standalone, to the extent standalone storage resources are located in many locations on the grid, this would just be a way to get around the track 1A limitations and potentially in the auction process create, this reintroduce the problems that were addressed by track 1A changes.
Go ahead, Partha.
Can I ask Doug, I would just be interested, are there any limitations that you might think that we might want to place on this to address some of your concerns? I feel like based on the feedback, there was like a strong push for allowing this, at minimum in the auction process. But yeah, I was just wondering and so particularly given that stakeholder feedback, I was wondering, like, is there anything you'd propose in terms of maybe a limitation that might help address the concerns that you raised?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a simple thing to do would be to require that people who are nominating this type of CRR would demonstrate that they're actually injecting energy at one location and withdrawing it at the other location, so that they actually have an exposure to congestion in the day-ahead market.
Okay, some sort of attestation or demonstration or something like that.
Not just an attestation. I think just demonstrate that they inject energy and withdraw it. I mean, this sort of links to the BAMX proposal on the auction. I mean, I think there should be a requirement that the auction participation be limited to your actual use of the ISO grid. And this would fit right in with that concept.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, thanks, Doug.
And the ISO has that information, right? You know who's injecting where. I mean, I think you have to maybe address affiliate issues, but you need to address those anyway for market power concerns.
Thank you, Doug. I don't see any other ISO comments, but let's do calling user 3. Hopefully that's okay with the team, and then no more comments after that.
Yeah, this is Noha Sidham on behalf of ETI. First, I want to echo APNWay and Calpine's request to further explore expanding the nodes. A lot of our members complain about not being able to hedge, and these members, they finance assets, they serve load, so they run sort of the gamut of a lot of different services that they offer in the RTO ISO market. So it's really important for them to be able to create a diversified portfolio to hedge, to manage basis risk. So it's sort of the first point I wanted to make. And then the second point is really more of a request for Hillary and Partha. I think it might be really helpful for us to cover some precedent from FERC on, non-discrimination and competition, and the importance of having both physical and non-physical participants participate in this market. And you can see, MISO just did an analysis on this a year and a half ago in their market, and they basically said without financial participants in their FTR market, they wouldn't actually be able to fund some of their rights. So more money is going back to customers because you have folks that are financial participants in the space, in line with the FERC precedent on competition and non-discrimination. So I would really love a little bit more education on that, because I think that we're covering something that falls squarely outside of exactly what FERC directed. Thank you.
Thank you. And we do have a hand raised in the room from Chris Devon. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Chris Devon with Calpine. I just wanted to respond quickly to Doug Boccioni's point about the resource adequacy charging requirements, or just slice a day. So I think I understand and respect the suggestion that he's presenting in his comments there about the use of the grid. But I just want to clarify that there's nothing really in the Slice a Day program that requires those resource adequacy resources to actually be, physically charging those storage units. It's simply a accounting exercise where you have to provide a number of megawatts to, be able to charge your resources, including the round trip efficiency. And there's really no test of where those are located. They could be, electrically located very far away and not necessarily really would be, operated in the sense of physically charging a resource that's shown for resource adequacy. So just want to clarify that point and, follow on to the last commenter as well. I missed her name, but I would, like to second those opinions and thoughts as well, and note that I think Calpine does generally use CRRs to hedge their physical participation, our physical participation of the resources that we own and operate in California. But I think we also would agree that there's benefits to financial participation, where other entities are providing additional liquidity to the auction by participation as well, beyond just the physical use of the system. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other hands at this moment.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We are getting close to the end of the product definition section, our morning scheduled content here. But first, we have one more, we've got one more item on storage. And this is looking at the second idea that I mentioned had come up in the working groups about whether or not co-located, whether or not storage should be included not just as an eligible sink in the auction, but also as load that is eligible to receive nominated CRRs through the allocation process. And so what you have seen in the paper is that we are not proceeding with that. We are not proceeding with that option right now. Currently, storage, NGR storage charging load, our storage charging energy is not treated as load. There are a number of different stipulations and cost allocations that come with being treated as load. So if that were to change, that would be a larger change than just a CRR change. But we, on further consideration, we do not see this as being similar to the load that is the measured demand that we use to define allocation eligibility. But we recognize that this was something that came up in the scoping phase and that there were some stakeholders who were interested in. So we wanted to acknowledge it here, and to the extent that stakeholders have additional feedback on that, the conversation can continue. So that is our last item on storage. We already went through whether or not we just talked through whether or not we should open it up as a sink. And the final additional area that we looked at in discussions was co-located and hybrid. And so, as noted, that has not been included in the current straw proposal, but again, if stakeholders have additional feedback or thoughts on that, that is welcome. So that brings us to the end of the storage section. Does anybody have any additional thoughts or feedback before we wrap up this segment?
Looks like we have a hand raised from Steve Keen. Go ahead, Steve.
This is Steve Keen from Edison. Just on this issue, the question, when energy is delivered to storage, do they pay the grid charges on that? I don't know the answer to that.
They do not. It is not currently charges that are allocated to measured demand. No.
Okay. Then it seemed, I thought the allocation was supposed to be for entities that are paying for the grid. So if storage doesn't pay for the grid, then seems like not entitled to the. Except, I mean, with the exception of maybe, what we talked about before, if there's a load serving entity that wants to use part of its allocation percentage or whatever to move the energy to storage, that would be different. They might do it, but storage isn't paying. If they want to be eligible for allocation CRRs, the trade-off might be that they start paying the grid charge on the energy they're putting into.
And I think that's a good distinction to clarify, right? In the previous topic, we were talking about to the extent that an LSC, well, we were talking about eligibility in the auction, but then, for example, Eric brought up scenarios under which an LSC might wish to use a portion of its eligible quantity to hedge charging load congestion risk. But right, what's being talked about here is the treatment of storage charging as actual incremental load. And to your point, that does not pay fees associated with being part of load today. And if that were to change, right, there would be potentially, that's a larger change that would have other ramifications besides just allocation eligibility. And I'll pause there too. Does anyone else from CAISO want to chime in?
Not seeing any other responses, Hillary. We do have one more hand raised online from Eric Little. Go ahead, Eric.
Hi, Eric Little from CalCCA. So if we're going to base this on who pays the transmission access charge, then pump storage hydro shouldn't be eligible either. If you look at section 26.1 of the ISO tariff, the access charge says that all market participants withdrawing energy from the CAISO controlled grid shall be assessed access charges in accordance with section 26.1, blah, 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 except as provided in section 4.1 of the appendix I and for storage resources, which is the station power protocol. And then for storage resources, including non-generator resources and pump storage hydro units withdrawing energy for later resale to the CAISO markets or to provide ancillary services. So if we're basing this on transmission access charge, then no storage device, including pump storage, should get it, which they currently do. I don't think that's the right way to go because ultimately the consumers are paying to have the transmission access to be able to store in a battery because they need that to be able to meet RPS requirements, to be able to meet load requirements, etc. So it is a use by load that they are paying for. Because if the storage is not paying the transmission access charge, the customer is paying it when they consume the final energy at their location. So I don't actually think that makes a difference, but if it does make a difference, then we shouldn't be making pump storage hydro eligible either. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric.
And I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this moment. So did you have any other final thoughts, Hillary, or should we go to break?
We have one more very short section here.
Perfect.
It's really more of just a placeholder. Excuse me. So there was one additional topic that was touched on in the December 12th paper on product definition, and that was auction schedule and frequency. Because there had been some discussion in the scoping phase about the schedule on which there's an opportunity to rebalance CRR portfolios and potentially options between the current year ahead and month ahead structure that the ISO uses. And so that was touched on in the paper, and that was an area that it fits partly here. It came up in some of the discussions about product definition, but as we were looking at it internally, we feel it might be more efficient to consider that alongside our other portfolio of auction update ideas. So wanted to touch on it here this morning just to recognize that was in the paper on product definition, but we're going to port that over and talk about that mostly in the auction structure section. So we'll have some more material on that later today. And if anyone has questions on that, those are welcome, of course, and I've got some more slides on it later. So that brings us to the end of our material on the December 12th paper. And I'll pause here maybe just for 10 seconds. I think next we can go on break. We're running a little bit ahead of schedule, so we're planning in real time here, but I would propose that we keep our 12 to 1 lunch hour, but move for the next 90 minutes into our afternoon material on auction efficiency and revenue adequacy enhancements. And on the CAISO side, does that work for everybody?
Looks like it does.
All right.
Yes.
Well, then I'll pause for 5 seconds here. Does anybody have any further comments on product definition?
Steve, is that an old hand or did you have a question? Okay. Not seeing any other hands raised at this time.
All right. Well, why don't we, oh, Bonnie?
Could we please unmute Bonnie Blair?
Was an operator error.
Oh, Bonnie, do you have a question or no?
No.
No question
I
from
do not.
Bonnie. Sorry. Okay, go ahead, team.
Not seeing any other questions at this time. So with that, we will take a 10-minute break and return around 10:48, closer to 10:50. Thank you.
So welcome back, everybody. We are running a little bit ahead of schedule. So we are now going to proceed into the content that we had originally scheduled for the afternoon, which is to talk about the issue paper on revenue adequacy and auction efficiency that was published last Wednesday. So as with everything else, this is available on the initiative webpage, and we're going to be taking comments collectively on February 4th on both the product definition paper we just discussed, this issue paper, and then of course the conversation today. So we're going to take these two pieces, revenue adequacy and auction efficiency, separately. These, in addition to product definition, are the three main areas that we identified in the scoping phase. So we're going to talk about revenue adequacy and then move on into auction efficiency. And just up front, sorry, one moment here. Sorry, equipment adjustments here. So before we get into the content, I wanted to make a couple notes on where we are in the process, because as you know, we're a little bit earlier on these issues than we are on product definition. So what we aim to do with the issue paper here is to compile all of the policy ideas that came up in the working group already. We had a number of ideas raised by stakeholders in the scoping phase discussions, and we wanted to make sure that at that point we were focused on scoping and problem statements, but that those ideas were not lost and are carried forward into policy development. So we're kind of compiling the things that we've heard so far. We've got a couple things in there that came out of some of our presentations, such as our benchmarking as well. And we try and point out some questions for further development. So none of these are proposals. We are more just looking at the ideas we've collected so far, trying to point out important questions for further development. And what this is all leading up to is the development of a straw proposal on these ideas later in the year. So with that, we'll move into our first topic, which is revenue adequacy. You'll also hear us talk about revenue inadequacy. And with the understanding that we've seen this graph many times, but just to start us off, we wanted to very briefly touch on again how we are defining revenue adequacy. And so what you can see on the left side of the graph there is revenue adequacy is about how well CRR processes converge to day-ahead market. And so if you have the notional value of, if you have the notional value of your CRRs from both the auction and the allocation as equal to or less than the congestion rent that is collected in the day ahead market, you are revenue adequate. If the nominal value is higher, as you can see in our graph here, then you have revenue inadequacy represented by our purple bar there. And so this metric is really about how well our CRR model and processes that produce the notional value of CRRs converge to our actual day ahead congestion revenue collection. I'll touch briefly here. I'm not going to read these out loud because they're long, but for those of you who have been with us in the scoping phase, they'll be familiar. These are our problem statements from the scoping phase that speak to revenue adequacy and inadequacy. So problem statements 3 and 4. And in our discussion of policy ideas, what we wanted to start from is the root cause analysis that we talked about at the working group meetings last February and March, because in those meetings, we looked at some analysis from our market analysis group on CRR market outcomes since the last round of CRR policy updates in 2019. And a lot of the discussion after that was flowed from the 3 main contributors to revenue inadequacy that came out of that root cause analysis. So this is actually pulled directly from that discussion. And the finding there was that the 3 main, the 3 main contributors to revenue inadequacy, these are not in order, but missing power flow contributions from locations with small shift factors that fall below the existing threshold. So looking at the shift factor threshold. Power flow contributions from loop flows. We'll talk more about that. And then all other model differences between the CRR model that calculates the notional value of our CRRs and the day ahead market model. So I wanted to revisit that. We wanted to revisit that because that really provided the structure for a lot of our conversations about how to improve revenue adequacy, and the ideas that we heard generally fall into those categories. So we're going to go through each of them in turn. First, we'll talk about the shift factor threshold. And we wanted to take some time to just briefly review what this phenomenon is, how it works. And so in order to do that, we have to look at both the CRR model and the day ahead market. The shift factor threshold that we've been talking about here is in the day ahead market. And this is something as established in the tariff. There is a shift factor threshold of 2% used in the day ahead market, except for default load aggregation points and trading hubs, which use 1/10 of that. And there's an older record on this, but generally speaking, the reason that a shift factor threshold was adopted, there are implications for both optimization results and also for calculation complexity and runtime in the day ahead market. If we move then and look over at the CRR model, the CRR model has a different set of circumstances that don't require a shift factor threshold. One of them is that we're running this on a different time interval. That's a recurring theme in this section. So the runtime constraints are different than for the day ahead market. And the CRR market is also simplified and doesn't perform the same functions. So this is how we arrive at the starting point where we have this 2% shift factor threshold for the most part used in the day ahead market and no threshold in the CRR model. There are reasons for both of those, but it does result in an asymmetry between the models. So one of the ideas that came up in the scoping phase discussions was, if this is a source of difference between these 2 processes, could we look at reducing the shift factor threshold in order to reduce the divergence between these 2 models? And so a couple things to highlight about this idea. First of all, this would be a change, even though we're talking about it in the context of CRR impacts. This is not a CRR system change. This would be a day ahead market change. And so that would need to be considering a larger array of implications outside of just the CRR system. The 2% threshold in the day-ahead market is also aligned with the threshold used in the real-time market. So there is contingency there. I'm sorry, not contingency, relatedness. And so that alignment is something that needs to be considered as well. And in general, if we were looking at this, we'd be looking at a bigger change and a bigger conversation than just within the CRR system. There has been some work at other ISOs similar to the CAISO adopting a sub 2% threshold for the trading hubs and DLAPs. There has been some work at other ISOs such as MISO to reduce this threshold. But one thing that we want to note, because it came up, for example, when we had some of the other ISOs presenting at the working group meeting last April, is that direct comparison is difficult because the CAISO is unique in North America in that we use AC power flow for our market optimization. And so that increases the complexity of the calculation, and that makes the impacts of a lower shift factor threshold not directly comparable to similar efforts in other ISOs. So we want to make sure that this idea is captured and carried forward in the conversation, while also recognizing that this is really a bigger idea than just, it has impacts outside of the CRR system. If this was going to be considered, it would need to consider the full scope of interactions in the day-ahead market. And in general, you can see we've got our last bullet point there, and we'll get into more of these in a minute here. But in general, when we look at the scope of ideas that came up in the scoping phase, changing the shift factor threshold in the day-ahead market is not likely to be the measure that could improve revenue adequacy the fastest, nor would it be the simplest to implement. So as we consider all of these ideas going forward, we wanted to note that there are likely other things that would be more self-contained and could help with this metric sooner. But I'll pause there. I see we have a hand. Why don't we pause and take any questions on the shift factor threshold issue?
We have a hand raised from Bonnie Blair. Go ahead, Bonnie.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. I work with the Six Cities group. Forgive me if this is something that someone experienced with modeling would get intuitively, but it seems to me that another way to eliminate the asymmetry that you mentioned is from the direction of the CRR model. And I don't remember any discussion of whether you could improve the symmetry between the models by using the same set of shift factors in the CRR model as are used in the day ahead model. And it wouldn't seem to involve at least some of the same complexities that would arise from messing with the day ahead model.
Thank you, Bonnie. I can maybe get started on that, and then if anyone else on the CAISO side wants to weigh in, please do. So I think there are a couple of points maybe that are relevant to that. On the one hand, the global derate factor that we use on the CRR side does account for some transmission not being available. It accounts in some ways for a certain amount of difference between the day-ahead market and the CRR model.
Right,
So,
but that's an untargeted thing, right? That's like a sledgehammer.
Exactly, you're correct. It's a universal factor, not specific to constraints. So you're exactly right. That's not a customized solution. I think there wasn't an organic need for a shift factor threshold on the CRR side, and where there's not, there would be sort of precision implications for adopting one. But nonetheless, I take your point that it's a simpler system in the day-ahead market. So I think we don't have a definitive answer on that right now.
I mean,
but I hear what you're saying.
Just the logic of it, you know. I mean, you go at it one way and there's problems, but if you just flip it the other way and try going at it by revising the CRR model. I mean, you don't have the same solution time concerns. It seems like a simpler approach. But maybe there are, maybe modelers will tell me that's crazy for reasons I'm not seeing.
I will feedback noted, and I think maybe that's something that we could explore as we get into this topic. I'm not seeing any, yeah, no hands from Partha. Okay, yep. So thank you, Bonnie, for taking. Yeah.
Before we go to the next online question, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, this is part of the, at least I'd say too, I know that we have a couple people from our CRRT implementation team on the call. We've had some conversations around that in terms of the solution set and what's, day-ahead solutions versus real time. Yeah, we can follow up on that, Bonnie, but if someone from the, if anyone from the KISO CR implementation team want to weigh in, yeah, welcome your feedback there too.
We do have Philip Roth. Let's go ahead and take Philip. He's from ISO. Unmute his hand.
Hi, good morning. Yeah, this is Philip Roth on the CRR team here at KISO. I think that is something maybe we could discuss internally too, just to think through that a little bit more. I think the main things we need to look at there would be both the implementation, as far as whether that's something that we could do if we wanted to, and then I think there would be implications as far as which CRRs would be impacted by that. So certain things as far as CRR bids and offers that are currently providing like counterflow, if that sensitivity cutoff is increased, would those still show up as sensitive as providing counterflow, things like that. So I guess that's just to say maybe we can take a closer look at that, and we would need to maybe better understand the implications before moving to that sort of decision.
Thanks, Phil. And thank you, Bonnie. I appreciate the suggestion.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next online hand, we have a couple in the room. First, we have Jordan Miner, and then we have Steve Keen after.
Hi, Jordan Miner, CBC Energy Division again. Thanks for this presentation on revenue adequacy. On this SIF factor threshold issue, is it a fair assessment to say that this is not a large cause of revenue adequacy and overall something that we don't need to be that concerned about? And I also would want to back up Bonnie's suggestion of ever use an interesting analysis of the viability of her idea.
Thank you. We do see, based on the findings of the root cause analysis last year, which that looked at a subset of historically the most revenue inadequate constraints. So the causes vary by constraint, but we did find that looking at that group, it was significant on at least some. So we have some analysis to back up that this is a significant issue overall, but I think how it is addressed, for example, like Bonnie's suggestion, there might be multiple ways. And the significance of it depends on the constraint that you're looking at, for sure.
How difficult would it be to expand this analysis to look at a more holistic overall examination of the grid? Because it might be significant on a few constraints and a few intervals, but on like a quarterly or annual basis, is this like an actual issue? I don't know, I'm just asking.
It's a good, yeah, thank you. It's an important one. We have Kyle on the phone, who was part of the team that did the root cause analysis. And Kyle, do you want to speak to that a little bit and maybe review a little of how we chose the subset that we focused on there?
You might be double muted, Kyle, if you're speaking right now.
Sorry about that, everybody. Yes, as Hillary just mentioned, we did go into it from a dollar perspective, right? So the top constraints that we were looking at were chosen just from a, historically, the most inadequate constraints from, total, dollar amount. However, there might be some that are just more inadequate from like a percentage standpoint. But and among those, some of the ones that were the most impacted are the smaller, transformer constraints, 69 kV, 70 kV transformer small lines, right, that don't have a ton of capacity as it is, right? So they're more susceptible to impacts from small shift factor impacts. And, in some cases we saw it lead to a settlement reversal where, despite, the congestion happening one way, ultimately this drove the estimated flows from the CR side the other direction and, resulted in charges. So that's something that can occur. As far as looking at this from like a, continuous standpoint, kind of getting an updated estimate of the impact, it is kind of an intensive process to get that information since it requires market reruns. Especially, expanding it to all constraints, just adds to more, a little bit more complexity. And, we only have so many resources to kind of, pull together for various, other processes that might require that, rerun capacity. So at this time, it's kind of it's on an as needed basis, but hopefully that answers your question. Open to questions as well.
Next, did you have a response? Okay. Next, we'll go to Steve Keen.
Hi, Steve Keen from Edison. One thing, if you start doing this analysis and looking at it, one thought that occurs to me is essentially what you're doing by putting these thresholds into the CRR model is making the CRR model less accurate. And one of the things that concerns me is if, yes, that would make it more equivalent to what's going on in the day ahead market. But I'm just not sure that if you have both models that are somewhat less accurate, that they're necessarily going to be less accurate in the exact same ways. So I'd be concerned that, that would be one thing I think that we'd need to check is to make sure that by doing that, we're actually getting a better match between the two models and not just, creating two models that are each less accurate, but potentially less accurate in different ways. It could make the situation actually worse rather than better. I don't know. I think that's something that would have to be explored empirically by looking at it just to see what's going on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Not seeing any other hands in the room, so we can go take some online calls. First, we have Callie Wells. Go ahead, Callie.
WPTF, can you hear me okay?
You're a little quiet.
Okay, is this any better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. I'll be really brief. So I appreciate you guys continuing the conversation on this. I think, as you mentioned, the analysis showed this is a major contributing factor to the revenue inadequacy. And I do think it's absolutely worth continuing exploring how to address it. I just wanted to real quick note on something that you mentioned that looking at changing the shift factor threshold in the day ahead market extends beyond just, the impacts of the CR market. And yes, it is a change to the day ahead market, but a couple years ago, the CAISO went through a pretty quick process where they did decrease the shift factor threshold cutoff for the trading hubs and DLAPs down to that 0.2%. So you guys have, I'd encourage us to kind of go back and look at that effort because I think the framework and the structure is already there that kind of walks through the different impacts it could have and use that as a starting point to think about, okay, if we, also basically take the same approach, but for more nodes than just the trading hubs and DLAP. So just kind of want to throw that out there. It was a pretty quick process. It touched on all the impacts making this change would have, and I think it's a really good starting point to continue the conversations and look at expanding it to more than just those DLAPs and trading hubs.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next in the queue, we have Justin Cockrell. Go ahead, Justin.
I think Steve King and Callie Wells said some of what I wanted to say. It just seems like going in the wrong direction to make things less accurate. And Callie touched on this, but it's really the difference in having different shift factor thresholds, cutoffs at different types of nodes that causes some of that problem. And making the shift factor thresholds consistent across more types of nodes or all nodes would really help a lot. And it's my understanding, as Kyle already explained, I just want to emphasize here that this issue with the shift factor, with the different shift factor thresholds, is what can make a CRR that actually should reflect that there's congestion revenue reverse itself and go from being an asset to a liability, go from being a hedge to being a liability. And that's a serious problem that the CAISO faces. I want to ask a question, which is, if you have this optimization where you're looking at AC power flows, what is the benefit of that for accuracy compared to then having to have these higher shift factor thresholds? I would think that maybe having lower shift factor thresholds would lead to more accuracy in the day-ahead market models than doing the AC power flows. But that's a question.
Hello, this is George Angelidis with the ISO. Can you hear me, please?
Yes.
Yeah, so these are really connected, those two. The calculation of the shift factors really comes out of the network analysis model, which performs the AC power flow. They go together. They both provide accuracy. The AC power flow gives you the actual power flow at the beginning of your solution. And then in the solution, we're using a linear model to expand the power flow from the AC solution with a linearized model that's using the shift factors. And then that's how we represent the constraint, the transmission constraint in the optimal solution. Obviously, with lower threshold on the shift factor, you can capture more of the interactions that fall below that threshold. However, there are effects that you need to consider. I don't think that you will be gaining accuracy. You will be losing a lot of effectiveness in terms of price formation, because you will be allowing in the optimization large movements of your controls, like your generation schedules and stuff like that, because they have some small impact on the mitigation of a power flow constraint, and that is very costly. It will show very high LMP contributions from that congestion, and it's an inefficient practically to move large generation for a very small impact on the constraints. So you have to weigh in everything, and the shift factor threshold has an impact of mitigating a little bit your accuracy to have more realistic results, right? Because you're not only solving a mathematical model, you want to have some outcome in your solution that reflects reality. But there is also another practical consideration, which has to do with performance. Lowering the shift factor threshold, that means we have to calculate a vastly larger number of shift factors to pass through the optimization, and that takes a lot of time. So you have also an impact on performance. You have to really trade off between all this and find something that works. So the shift factor threshold around 2% is the one that historically we found to be the silver lining here. I hope this discussion helps.
Perhaps. I don't know. the whole point of having the shift factors and how that's used in calculating LMPs is so that you take into account, whether or not electrically distant generator or electrically distant, constraint actually has much of an impact on something. So it seems like having a lower shift factor threshold or no shift factor threshold, just really considering all of the impacts of everything, would be the most accurate thing. And then, the process works itself out, through actually, looking at the shift factor from those distant things to, whatever asset you're looking at, whatever constraint you're looking at, because, that's in the calculation. But okay.
You're
Something I
absolutely
could see.
correct. From a mathematical standpoint, you're correct. Having very low threshold or even zero, you could effectively be moving very remote generation with minimal effectiveness on your constraint, because mathematically, yes, you can relieve some of your congestion. But you practically, though, from a practical standpoint, moving large amounts of generation to have a very minute impact on the power flow on a constraint is not practical. And
I guess that's the opposite of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that as a practical matter, you wouldn't actually, change the dispatch of some generator that was on the, other side of the state, because you would have such a low shift factor that it just wouldn't end up playing out that way.
oh, then we agree, because I think we're saying the same thing, that having a shift factor threshold insulates you from these impractical movements.
No, I'm saying having
Okay.
don't need the shift factor threshold. That the shift factor itself prevents you from having impractical movements.
Well, if
just
without the shift
calculates
factor
things
threshold,
accurately if you don't have a cutoff for it.
maybe there is a misunderstanding there. If you don't have a shift factor threshold, that means you allow all the shift factors to take effect, and then you have all these remote interactions in your model. The shift factor threshold cuts them off at some level. So if you have less than, let's say, 2% effectiveness on constraint, then you just move this shift factor out. It's like you make it a zero. So therefore, that generator is not going to move to mitigate that constraint, because it only has very minute effectiveness. So that's what the threshold does. Right?
I don't know. We'll have to submit written comments.
Okay, thank you.
I was going to say we're welcome feedback on this in the written comments.
Next, we have Pushkar Waggle. Let's unmute him, and then Raul after that.
Wagley from Flint Resource Consultants on behalf of BAMX. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to follow up on the Bonnie's suggestion earlier on adjusting the CRR model rather than the IFM, and then Steve's caution that he indicated regarding the changes. And I believe if you start modeling this 2% shift factor threshold in the CRR model, wouldn't you release more CRRs, and wouldn't that in turn worsen the CRR inadequacy issue? And CRR team may want to confirm that. And then I believe that we would need probably to move to more targeted adjustments, or potentially derates by constraints or something like that, whether it is for the shift factor issue, or maybe what you're going to discuss later on the loop flow or unscheduled flow modeling issue. I think it's a sort of a similar issue that we need some more targeted treatment there, as opposed to more blunt instruments that we have been using so far. But that doesn't necessarily mean that while doing this exercise, you might in turn cause more revenue adequacy or more discrepancy within the models. Any comments?
Thank you. One thing I will say is I think the idea of constraint by constraint, more targeted treatments, that is something that's going to come up more in the next section on loop flow as well. I think that's a concept that has some applicability in a couple areas here. So we do plan to be talking more about that.
That's definitely a fruitful exercise. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you.
Next, next we have Raul. Raul, you might be on double. Muted, maybe. Go ahead, Raul.
Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Okay. So question on shift factor threshold. Is there a direct correlation that if the shift factor threshold is reduced, does it directly result in a better revenue adequacy? Irrespective of, we forget about, whether the impact, what is the impact on performance in day ahead?
I can get started with that, and then I invite anyone else from the CAISO side who wants to weigh in. But I think what we saw from the root cause analysis is that the difference, the impact of the shift factor threshold is significant. I think we don't have, it's not that direct and concrete a correlation that just reducing the shift factor would guarantee an improvement. But we saw from the root cause analysis that it was a significant cause on some constraints. Is that a fair summary, Kyle?
Correct. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, for some constraints, lifting the shift factor threshold would, remove that settlement reversal that we just talked about. In other senses too, right? There are some constraints that are heavily impacted by this. It may be periodic too. It's not necessarily across the board, but we found, some periods of time where, given constraint may be, more heavily impacted by this for whatever reason. It can lift it from deep revenue inadequacy to something that is more expected. Not completely solving it, but bringing it to a level that would be more, I guess, anticipated. But yes, I wouldn't say it's one-to-one, but it's definitely been shown to help in some certain circumstances.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out, is CAISO, because targeting a fix for what the future conditions are unknown would lead me to believe that it's a circular approach, right? You fix something, you find something different. So you might not get any relief, but some of those things are approximate. But if I go back to the idea of, what we are trying to do is the whole intention of looking at shift factor threshold to try to improve revenue inadequacy, or to give a better sense of how the congestion impacts the grid. And this is still philosophical, so I'll leave it open-ended and include in our comments. But I would love to know, what's the principle CAISO is going to use when it looks to, make any change.
Thank you, Rahul.
Next in the queue, we have Abram Klein. Go ahead, Abram.
To follow up on Callie and Justin's comments, and because I do think this is a very important issue, and I'm curious from the comments from CAISO staff earlier, whether CAISO has actually studied the feasibility of this in terms of how it would impact the day-ahead market, solve time, or that sort of thing, or is it just a question of resources to do that analysis? When we looked at the original shift factor cutoff issue, which took a very long time, market participants posed to California that why not fix the whole thing? And, Guillermo and California staff said, well, let's just do it for the load serving entities, the load zones. And I think there was an expectation that it would really fix the problem. It did fix some of the problems, especially on the low voltage constraints, but we've seen from the analysis that there's still a tremendous amount of revenue inadequacy coming from these, including congestion reversal. And I just also add that, one of the principles here in the problem statements is that that allocation of these shortfalls should be following cost causation principles. And this is a case where, just as with the load shift factor threshold issue, the problem is that the ISO is not collecting congestion from entities that are causing the congestion. So solving the issue, reducing the shift factor threshold in the day-ahead market would result in California collecting more congestion and reducing the underfunding burden. I don't think there's any question about that in terms of, just in terms of the question that Rahul was referring to. But, I do think that California needs to address this one way or the other, either through the revenue and adequacy allocation approach, which I know we're going to get to, or through fixing it fundamentally. And when California filed for Track 1B changes, which this process is intended to review, the notion was that Track 1B was more based on cost causation. I don't think FERC or California staff anticipated that we would see constraints that were as underfunded as we've seen consistently over the last 7 years. I know that that's not the case, that was the expectation from CAISO staff or from FERC. And some of the results that we see in the market are patently, frankly baffling, where you get congestion reverse, you don't just get, just massive levels of underfunding on certain constraints. So, the principle here is that you could address things like this, not through Track 1B, but by putting elements of underfunding that are unrelated to cost causation into the balancing account. Something that California suggested with respect to EDAM constraints in June, and I assume is part of this discussion. So this throwing it out there that this needs to be dealt with one way or the other, either by fixing it or by using a different allocation approach, where if it's not based on cost causation and you just don't want to address the problem, then it should be peanut buttered as broadly as possible.
Thank you, Abram.
And I'm not seeing any other questions coming in at this time.
All right. We will now move on to our next segment in revenue adequacy, which is the discussion of the effect of loop flows. So again, this was when we looked at the root cause analysis last year, another aspect that came up as a cause on our most revenue inadequate constraints of some revenue inadequacy. So we've got a little bit of background here, as with the previous segment. This is going to be review if you've been with us for the scoping phase, but just to go through it again. So when we talk about loop flow, we're talking about flow that is associated with flows that are not ISO market schedule associated. So it is an inherent characteristic of the ISO BA's interconnection with the broader Western grid. And in the CRR context, it represents a portion of transmission capacity being used by power flow that does not contribute to congestion revenue. And so the way that this relates to the revenue inadequacy topic is that if we don't account for the fact that some portion of transmission capacity is going to be associated with loop flow, then it can cause revenue inadequacy if you have more capacity being released as a CRR than is going to be contributing to congestion revenue in the day-ahead market. So that is the overall context of the issue. And what we're looking at here is then the representation of loop flow in the CRR model. And in the past, loop flows have not been explicitly modeled, but we have used the global derate factor in the CRR model to account for the fact that there is going to be a portion of transmission capacity that is not going to be associated with, it accounts for a number of factors, but one of those is the fact that some transmission capacity is going to be accounted for by loop flow that will not be contributing to congestion revenue. And so we should not be releasing that portion of capacity as a CRR. So there has been an indirect representation of loop flow in the past, but we had some discussions, a lot of discussion in the scoping phase, and especially coming out of the root cause analysis about whether that could be evolved to help reduce the revenue inadequacy associated with these loop flows. Because as was pointed out, forgive me, I think it was you, Bonnie, earlier, the global derate factor is the same across all constraints. And so it is it's an indirect and more universal tool, not on a constraint-specific basis. And loop flow varies across the constraints. So as we move into the policy development here, looking at next steps, there was strong support in the working group for looking at more explicit loop flow modeling. And so that is something that as we have come to the end of the scoping phase and moved into policy development, the ISO has already taken some steps internally to look at, can we do more explicit modeling under our existing tariff authority without necessarily needing new policy? So the update here is kind of twofold. Partially that there is some more specific loop flow modeling that we can pursue under existing tariff authority, and we have already initiated that. That'll be a process that we will provide updates on here because it's relevant to the outcomes that we're pursuing in this initiative. But we also, to the extent that we need new policy to further incorporate more explicit loop flow modeling, we'll be discussing that here. So there's kind of a two-pronged approach on this. We recognize that there was strong support in the scoping phase and very little opposition to more explicitly accounting for loop flows, and we're looking into what we can do on that in the more immediate timeline. And to note the last bullet point here, I know we have a couple hands, but I'll finish up the last bullet point here. So broadly speaking, over time, if the market footprint expands, we would expect that the impact of loop flow would decrease, only in the sense at a very simplified level that some of those flows that today are not associated with market schedules now would be associated with market schedules because the footprint has expanded and they are participating in the market. But that said, that's a very generalized relationship. And overall, there's a lot of unknown about the impact of loop flow on the CRR model in the future. So while we continue to coordinate with the regional conversation in this initiative, we see value in continuing to pursue explicit loop flow modeling here. So I'll pause there. We have a couple questions in the room and on the phone.
First, we'll go to Jordan Miner in the room.
Hey, thank you. Jordan Miner, CPUC Energy Division. So I kind of see this loop flow issue as the crossover between the CRE initiative and the EDAM CRA. And the comments we recently submitted to EDAM CRA that were posted yesterday, I believe we addressed this point in that this revenue tied to this loop flows under the currently approved EDAM CRA methodology is going to be allocated to the other BAs within EDAM. So I somewhat see this issue as a CRA issue, depending on what methodology outcomes out of the long-term policy development solution that we're working on in that initiative. So I'm not sure if we should address it in this initiative would be something I would consider.
Thank you. And you've hit on exactly the balance that we're trying to strike here. I agree that as many of you know, the second phase of congestion revenue allocation started up in December, and that will continue to be the process where the regional conversation plays out. The main thing we wanted to acknowledge with this bullet point is just that we've received some input on expectations about future changes given the regional conversation. And we just wanted to make the point that no matter how that change, no matter what that change ends up looking like in loop flow patterns, there will be some value on the CRR side to being able to model those loop flows more explicitly in our CRR model. So we see some value in pursuing that, regardless of the outcome of the broader conversation, which you're absolutely right, Jordan, will continue to be carried out in the congestion revenue allocation initiative. we won't be addressing that here.
Next, we have some questions online. First, we have Doug Boccignone. Go ahead, Doug.
Hi, Doug Boccignone for BAMX. Just a comment on the last bullet point about the impact of loop flows decreasing over time as the regional market expands. I mean, I think that's right from a revenue adequacy standpoint, but I don't think it diminishes at all the importance of exploring this issue in terms of how to model loop flow in the allocation and auction processes. Because, you know, if we don't model loop flow in those processes, we'll end up allocating CRRs that, you know, more CRRs or auctioning more CRRs than we should have otherwise. So I think we still have to address this in the model.
Thank you, Doug.
Next we have Abram Klein, APN Way. Let me check his audio.
Thanks. It's Abram with Appian Way. I think this is a really central issue, and it's one that's about more than just the modeling. I don't think that the loop flows issue will decrease as the market footprint expands. It really depends on what the rules are. And what the current rules are is that, I mean, look, everybody wants to build resources where there's a lot of renewable resources in the Southwest. There's a lot of solar development. It's been happening year over year over year. And every time California builds resources down there, that's internalized in the California market structure. And every time an entity that's outside of California, whether it's Market Plus or a different BAA, or even an EDM entity builds new resources in that area, you're basically eroding away California's rights to use its own system. And this is not about CRRs, this is about the congestion rents that belong to California ratepayers for investing in their grid. You know, what needs to happen, I think, in the EDAM process, but also with respect to other neighboring BAAs, and I'll note that FERC just issued a white paper in November on SEAMS coordination throughout the West, where they referenced market-to-market coordination, is the need for a business solution where California ISO and its market participants, its ratepayers who paid for the transmission grid, identify how much of the south to north transfer capability belongs to the California ratepayers and will continue to belong to the California ratepayers, and how much do EDAM entities get and how much do Market Plus entities get. And once you have that business solution with market participants, then you can say, okay, if you go above that amount, then you have to contribute to the congestion that's caused. Because as more and more resources are developed in that, you know, renewable rich location, and of course, you know, entities in the northern part of the WSCC would like to contract for solar resources in Nevada and Arizona. And of course, California entities in Northern California would want to as well. And there needs to be comparable treatment there. It shouldn't be that, you know, if a non-California BAA contracts for a new resource in Arizona, that California loses out on its rights, because then you will see the erosion over time. And I think that's been a really significant impact of why over the last 5 years, despite the global derate factor, we've really had a persistent problem with underfunding that's impacted all CRR users. So I think this is the crux of the issue for California to address in both working groups, but it goes beyond just modeling. It's about a business solution, about what the rights are for different market participants, and sticking to that and saying, if you go above those rights, then you have to pay. And that's typically how these markets work in other areas. And I think you're really getting to that, point in the process with respect to EDAM and other areas. Otherwise, you're just basically, it's fine for California to let others use their transmission grid. That's normal. But the fact that it's been growing and growing and growing, and California's share is lower, that's where the problem is. And there just needs to be an amount that's reasonable that results in a fair allocation.
Thank you, Abram. And one thing I'll note from that, I mean, as you said at the beginning, you're touching on some issues that are broader, that are beyond the scope of this initiative. But to the extent that we can model loop flows more explicitly in the CRR model, our goal here in pursuing that is to position the CRR system such that it can more granularly capture the effects of loop flows and help us release the correct amount of CRRs, regardless of the range of outcomes from the regional conversation. And I'll note, I think you just touched on a number of topics, but I'll note one thing for anyone online who is interested in the congestion revenue allocation discussion. As Jordan mentioned a couple of minutes ago, comments on that were posted they were posted yesterday. So there's a recent addition to the record for anyone who would like to follow that. But here we're looking with explicit loop flow modeling in the CRR model to basically position us to be better equipped to release the right number of CRRs in light of the entire picture. Thank you, Abram.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we did file comments there, and I made those points. I just add two other things. One is, I don't think California wants to have a snapshot where they sort of get it right in preparation for the auction, but then more loop flows are occurring year after year after year, and it's slowly eroding without addressing that problem. And then the second point that I would make is that this issue with respect to EDAM congestion or just loop flows in general is again it's a cost causation principle issue as well. So if you want revenue inadequacy funding to follow cost causation, then the fact that other entities are allowed to use California's system without paying for it should not be solely the responsibility of CRR holders. It can, you can address again this through, more precise cost allocation that follows cost causation principles.
Thank you, Abram.
I'm not seeing any other hands in person or online at this time.
All right. We have one more segment on major causes, solutions, ideas associated with major causes from the root cause analysis. So I think we can probably get through that, and then we will try and we'll take our break for lunch at 12 and continue on that section afterwards if we need to. But the last category is kind of a more general category for all other sources of divergence between the CRR model and the day-ahead market model. And so generally speaking, the more closely the CRR model can converge with the day-ahead market results, the more likely it is that the notional value of the CRRs will match the congestion revenue. And so we've talked a little bit, and this is true to some degree for the shift factor threshold and loop flows as well. We're talking about differences between the CRR model and the day-ahead market model, but there are other things as well. And so this shows just at a very generalized level, one of the challenges when we're looking at how to reduce divergence between these two models is that we're working with different time horizons. We're running the day ahead market every day. We're running the CRR model monthly. And so anything that experiences daily variation in the day ahead market has to be in some way captured in a single set of monthly inputs for the CRR model. So we've got a couple things on there. One of them is transmission status and outages. This is something that, of course, can vary by day in the day ahead market, but there's a snapshot needed in the CRR model. Shift factors are another. We talked about the shift factor threshold, but also, as came up in some of our previous conversations, just the shift factor matrices themselves change depending on outages. So there are a number of other factors that vary in the day ahead market that we have to capture in some way in the CRR model that by definition are not going to be representative of the variability in the day ahead market. And so our last category here is really about thinking about any other ideas that might help us reduce that divergence and thus reduce the likelihood and severity of revenue inadequacy. So we've got a couple different points here that came up in the scoping phase. First of all, this is something that has been looked at since the last time that the policies were updated. So that is the purpose of some of the changes adopted in 2019. For example, there was a new outage reporting deadline introduced to try and make sure that to the extent possible, outages are captured early enough to be able to be represented in the CRR model in the year ahead of the monthly processes. However, we see a range in when outage submissions come in. We don't always receive them in time we don't always receive them in time to incorporate them in the model. And we also, as with anything else that varies day to day, have to find a way to represent those in the CRR model. So for example, there's an existing methodology around if there will be an outage in a number of days, but not a whole month, how that is represented as wholly available, unavailable, or partially in the CRR model. So as we move into policy development, I think this area speaks to if there are any suggestions on how we can update how we are representing variation in the daily market in a CRR model that can potentially help us here. And then the last bullet there is about the timing. Today, there are no changes made to the CRR model after it is posted publicly, but sometimes new information will come in that, that could, if incorporated, help us reduce that divergence. And so we bring this up here to point out that if there was more flexibility to make changes after the model is published, then the final auction run could potentially more accurately reflect what's going to be happening in the day ahead market. But that would mean that there are model changes after the publicly posted version. So we put that out for consideration and are interested in feedback and generally in ideas for how to help us reduce divergence between the CRR model and the day ahead market, other than the loop flows and shift factor threshold that we previously discussed. And then finally, oh, please, yes, we have Jeremy Malikos.
Yeah, thank you. Jeremy Malikos, manager of CRR team. One thing to add here is on the late model changes, with the upgrade to the new system, we now have APIs. So making model changes on our side is simply something that could be done through your APIs. You'd get that update like immediately. So previously we would have to post an email and you'd have to go to the MUI and then you have to download it manually. Now this can all be done via APIs. So you could get the update to your systems theoretically as soon as we post them. So just something to consider as we look at making those changes.
Thank you. And yeah, I think you made me realize there's another thing worth making explicit here, that part of the reason that we currently today don't change the model after publication is we recognize that participants are using that model to develop auction bidding. So, but as you said, Jeremy, there's faster information transfer available now. So we're interested in feedback on whether this is something that that participants might see some benefits outweighing any costs from your perspective as participants in that process. And our final slide here, we just got into it, but we wanted to also touch on here, make sure that we're including in this conversation all of the relevant work streams. And as Jeremy just pointed out, one that is significant to our efforts here is that last year, the ISO transitioned to a new software platform for our CRR processes. And that is something that has changed since we began this conversation, because there are some additional capabilities here in terms of runtime and ability to make changes more quickly that we didn't have when this working group began meeting at the end of 2024. And so now that that transition is complete, of course, the transition in itself was a process, but now that that has completed, we are looking into, are there things that we can do now under our existing tariff authority, just on the basis of the enhanced modeling capabilities that could help with revenue adequacy without requiring new policy? And so that is something that, like I said, with the loop flow modeling, we're going to continue updating you here on that because it's relevant to our goals in this initiative. So we'll keep that in the conversation. Want to make sure you know that it's happening, and it may affect ultimately how we evaluate some of our new policy ideas here. We have so far one concrete version of that, and I apologize, just realizing I meant to put a date in there, but we have one change on this that we can share already, which is that currently in the CRR model, the global derate factor is applied to base constraints, but not contingency constraints. And we have determined that under the new software model, the new software platform, that we can do that. And so that is something that we are looking into, and we believe we can proceed with this year. It is going to be, because this is not a new policy, we are not going to discuss that in detail here, but there is a CPG schedule called, and I apologize, could anyone from CAISO chime in for me? Do we have a date for that? Or is that is to be scheduled? Yes, thank you. So we will be exploring that in the more model-specific forum, but it is something that we are hopeful that we will be able to help get us some pretty, some relatively fast improvements in the accuracy of the amount of CRRs that we're releasing. And because it is applying the global derate factor to a larger set of constraints, the expected outcome is that it will result in fewer CRRs being released, but that amount of CRRs will be more accurate to the congestion revenue that we actually expect to see in the day-ahead market. So I know we're almost at lunch here. I'll pause there. And sorry, one more. We've got a summary. Oh, Jeremy, please.
I just, Jeremy Malekos again. I would also like to just add to this that, as stated earlier, I think Bonnie mentioned the global derate factor as being like a sledgehammer applied to the CR model. And I think the approach that we're trying to take here is that would be a short-term fix that we see we can make immediately. And then we're looking at medium term, you would see more specific constraint changes that we could model that are specific issues. We're not there yet with how we want to do that. We're still working on it. And then I think if you think about this initiative, the long-term solution is really what comes out of the stakeholder initiative here. So I think the approach we're trying to take with a lot of these changes, especially in light of the new system that we have, that my team is modeling and using to produce the CR allocation in auction markets, is that we can start making short-term changes, medium-term changes, and then ultimately what this initiative decides is the long-term fix. So I think if we frame it that way, we're not, you can see the global derate factor as being like the initial attempt at bringing us to a more accurate model as we move forward with more specific solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. So this brings us to the end of the revenue adequacy section, which is good timing. But just to review in summary here, what came out of the scoping phase? There are many causes of revenue inadequacy and many possible solutions. And so part of what we're looking to do as we begin policy development on this is to look at, among all the options that were identified, are there new ones that should be considered? And also, out of the whole list, what do we expect in terms of the balance of benefits for improving revenue adequacy, while also balanced against feasibility, against timeline to implement, and with the overall goal of looking at how we can improve revenue adequacy as quickly and efficiently as possible. So we welcome feedback on your relative prioritization of the things that we discussed in this section. If you have new ideas that haven't been in the mix yet, we would love to hear them. As just discussed, there are some things that, due to the software change, we're looking at potentially being able to make some progress on the revenue adequacy metric without new policy. So we will incorporate those here alongside our consideration of new ideas that do require it. So with that, thank you everybody for the discussion on this section. Do we have any closing questions or comments on revenue adequacy?
I'm not seeing any hands in the room, and I'm not seeing any online either.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for all the discussion this morning, and we will pick up after lunch with auction efficiency. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Those of you in the room, those of you on air, thank you for joining us. We, as you all know, we're running a little bit ahead of schedule. So this morning we covered our topics on product definition and revenue adequacy. For the afternoon, we are going to delve now into our final remaining topic, which is auction efficiency. And this is a segment of the issue paper that was released last Wednesday. So if you want to find that, it's posted on the initiative website. As with the revenue adequacy piece, what we're doing here today is mostly just reviewing ideas around auction efficiency that came up in the scoping phase discussions and trying to highlight some questions for further consideration as we continue to develop these issues and move into straw proposal development. So let's get into it. As with revenue adequacy, we're starting here with just a very brief reminder of how we have defined auction efficiency in this initiative so far. So for that, you can look on the right side of the slide here. We have defined auction efficiency as being about how well CRR auction prices discover the congestion payout in the day-ahead market for auction CRRs. So you can see we've got the auction revenue, the auction payout, and the difference there, the brown bar to the far right, looks at how efficient the auction is at anticipating the payout. And we recognize upfront that there was a lot of discussion in the scoping phase about the extent to which this definition addressed the problem that stakeholders are interested in, the extent to which it did or did not include other sources of value. We had stakeholders who raised points about connections, for example, between the auction and the bilateral energy markets. So we recognize that this is a whole conversation. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later on, but just up front, as a reminder, for example, when we have talked about auction efficiency numbers in this conversation so far, this is how it has been defined. As earlier, you can see here our problem statements on auction efficiency. Problem statements 1 and 2 of our 5 speak to those. And so I won't repeat them totally, but we're looking at improvements to auction efficiency as well as elaboration on all of the different sources of value. So we're going to talk about both of these as we get more into the policy ideas that came up in the discussion phase or in the scoping phase. The structure of this is 4 main areas. So we had ideas that came up around auction structure, the fundamental design of the auction, most prominently the willing seller market design from the Department of Market Monitoring. We had some suggestions around auction participation and who can participate in the auction, who is eligible. We had some discussion around auction pricing. Schedule and frequency. This is the topic that we touched on in the product definition section, and I mentioned is now going to be treated in the auction efficiency section so that we can consider it alongside other auction changes. So we'll talk about that more extensively here. And then the last one there, this is not fundamentally an auction issue, but just for today, we have grouped revenue shortfall allocation methodology in with the auction efficiency measures, because when it was brought up in the scoping phase discussions, the context of that was there were stakeholders who voiced that they saw a relationship between the impacts of the CRR1B shortfall allocation methodology that were implemented in 2019 and subsequently the levels that participants were bidding in the auction and consequently the auction efficiency. So we bring it up here because it's been related to auction efficiency in some of the conversations while recognizing that it is not part of the auction structure itself. We'll go through each of these areas in turn then. So starting with auction structure. And just up front, I want to acknowledge that there was a wide range of perspectives on how and even whether at all the auction structure should change. This is the area probably in the whole initiative that we saw the widest range of stakeholder perspectives on. And at the highest level, we can kind of group those positions into two main areas. We had some stakeholders who saw auction efficiency, who saw auction structure as the primary place we should focus if we want to improve auction efficiency. So looking directly at how the auction is structured and designed, including the willing seller method. And then we had some stakeholders whose position on auction efficiency was that it is a characteristic that arises from primarily a number of other things besides auction structure. And they felt that if we were interested in auction efficiency, we should be looking at improving revenue adequacy, reducing uncertainty around CRR payout, and arguing that consequently, if that happened, then you would see an increase in bids in the auctions that would increase revenue and you would increase efficiency. So we had a range of opinions on whether or not, if you want to improve auction efficiency, you should look at auction structure or look elsewhere. So that's something that we'll continue to explore as we move through policy development. And in terms of concrete proposals, as I said, the most concrete one that we have in the mix so far is from the Department of Market Monitoring, proposing the willing seller market design idea. I do see your hand, Justin. I'm gonna go through this slide and then we'll pause for questions. Well, I'll pause for questions after each area here. So going forward, if we are to consider changes to the auction structure, we have some key questions here that we want to highlight that would need to be addressed for any changes in market structure. One being, how would any of the proposed changes affect physical energy market participants' ability to hedge? CRRs are meant to function as a hedging tool. We want to be aware of the implications of any changes for their ability to serve that purpose. How would any proposed changes affect the auction's capacity for price discovery? This was something that we, again, heard mixed opinions on, or diverse perspectives on in the scoping phase. We had some stakeholders arguing that, for example, the willing seller market design would improve price discovery. We had others that felt that price discovery that the liquidity is extremely important for price discovery, and they had concerns about liquidity under a different auction structure than we have today. So that's something we'd have to consider. We would want to think about interactions with the allocation process. This is something that we heard questions from stakeholders on about if we were to make changes to the auction, how would that impact not only auction outcomes, but what we could release in the allocation? And could load serving entities expect to receive more or fewer, any different number of CRRs in the allocation compared to our current structure today? So we don't have any ideas that have been proposed yet that have a direct connection between the auction structure and the allocation process, but we want to make sure that we're looking at that interaction. to the extent that it exists. And then finally, we had perspectives from stakeholders talking about the role that the auction plays in broader energy pricing dynamics, including in the bilateral market, which we recognize is outside the visibility of the CRR system here. So this is something that would need further discussion if we're considering auction structure changes. One of the things that has come up, and I'll reiterate it here, is to the extent that there is any ability to quantify some of those pricing impacts, that would be very helpful in policy development. But we want to acknowledge that that was raised by some stakeholders in scoping, and it should continue to be covered in the discussions going forward. So our goal here is to highlight that there are some key questions that, whether it's willing seller or any other auction structure change, would need to be addressed going forward. And we've got a couple questions, so I'll pause here.
First, we'll go to Jordan Miner in the room.
Thanks, Hillary. This is Jordan, CBC. So I have two questions, two different things. One is a follow-up question on the data analysis request from CalCCA. In our last round of comments, we had endorsed and supported CalCCA's data request regarding the liquidity under willing by a willing seller, and we've had other follow-up conversations about this in different forums with different people. And I wanted to know if there's more detail on that analysis, because in the issue paper, it's only a couple sentences. And then my second question is on this Oberlassy model addressing generators' concerns to CRs. If we did willing buyer, willing seller, could the CAISO expand on that or provide more of their thoughts on that idea? Because it was a totally new idea.
Yeah, thank you. So there were two pieces there. On the analysis, we do not have any new analysis to share yet. I think as we move into policy development, that is a key. We're aware that request is outstanding, and we are looking at how we can provide something that will help address that question of, I mean, I think that gets partly to the first question on the slide there about how will the results affect ability to hedge. So we're looking into how we can address that request. This is a good point to add that if there are other forms of analysis as we move into policy development that stakeholders would find useful, we would love to hear about those. I think we already heard some of that in the product definition time of use period discussion this morning. So we are at the beginning of policy development, we're looking at what our next round of analysis could and should look like, with the acknowledgement that that request has been outstanding for a while, and that is something that we're continuing to work on, but don't have anything new to share yet. And then the second part of your question, forgive me, could you give me the second part again?
Yeah, so one of the questions that we've had running is about how generators are with willing buyer, willing seller. And then one of the workarounds you guys proposed in the paper is potentially Oberlassy CR for them. And it was, I never thought about doing that, and I just wanted to hear more about that idea and what that would entail.
Thank you. There isn't a concrete proposal there, but it's more that we wanted to make sure, given that that model has been out there for a while, but historically has had pretty low participation. And so we just wanted to make sure that as we're having this broader conversation about reform, that we keep that in the conversation in the sense that if there are changes to that model or updates that could be useful for some of our goals here, we want to make sure that we're making use of that option to the best of its potential. So we haven't had any stakeholder proposals on how to change the Oberlassy model so far, but if anyone has those, this would be, we'd like to hear them.
Thank you.
Next, we have a few questions online. First, we'll take a question from Justin Pranu. Go ahead, Justin.
It's Justin from Calpine Energy Solutions. I'll have a question, and depending on the answer, I might have a follow-up. Could you move back one slide? In that sort of the first bullet point there regarding auction structure, where does planning, the balance of planning period for Bob style auctions sort of fit into that. I know seller willing buyer was one of them, or are you thinking of more of a sort of a second bullet point?
And you said the balance of planning period option you're asking about,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, to me, I think that would just be the auction structure, sort of the first bullet point. That would just sort of be a subsection under that.
Correct. And I think with we'll get to this in a bit, but the balance of planning period structure or other changes to what is available in each auction, I think the inclusion of that here is partly due to the fact that, it's related to auction structure. From what we heard in the scoping phase, I think that was less directly about auction efficiency and more about feedback from stakeholders about how often it would be helpful to be able to rebalance their portfolios. But that maybe plays into the second point about that we heard from some stakeholders, that to the extent that you have a tool that better meets your hedging needs, there may, not necessarily, but maybe some change in bidding. But overall, I agree with you that it most directly fits into the first one of being an auction structure change.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's been our position, is that the bot style auctions, along with some improvement in some of the other things, and number two, sort of go hand in hand together. So to improve the auction.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any other hands at this time. Oh, we do have one more call-in user. Go ahead.
Calling user 9 may be double muted. Oh, he hung up. Christina, we'll try reaching out to him.
Okay. We're having some sound issues from call-in user 9, so we'll move on at this time and circle back later.
Moving on then. Our next area is around auction participation. And these slide titles are conceptual groupings for the purpose of organizing the conversation today. They're not mutually exclusive. But another area that we heard feedback on in the scoping phase was about auction participation and eligibility to participate in the auction. We heard a suggestion from the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group, BAMX, as Doug alluded earlier this morning, suggesting that auction participation be limited to physical energy market participants who are exposed to congestion risk in the physical energy market. So if we were going to talk about auction eligibility, there are a couple areas that we would need to make sure that we address. One is that no undue discrimination is taking place in the determination of who is able to participate in the auction. And another would be, to the extent that we are adopting eligibility criteria, we need to make sure that we have a verification methodology in place, and we would need to think about the feasibility of that, whatever those criteria are. So that's one, there are a couple things we would have to think through with that. We have call-in user 9, your hand is up again. We can go to you. And if we have any other questions on auction participation.
Yeah, hello, this is Noha. I have a couple of things. One on auction participation. Again, I do think it would be helpful to go over the FERC precedent on competition here. That I think is integral to this conversation. And sorry, I think my phone had cut out earlier when I was trying to get in the queue earlier. You had mentioned that you guys were trying to provide some analysis on the willing seller, willing buyer concept. And I'm wondering what exactly you're analyzing there, and what data are you actually looking at to provide information?
Thank you. Sorry, you were calling user 3 in the morning. I didn't realize it was still you. So thank you. The question about the analysis. So this was a request that came in during the scoping phase from the load serving entity side about analysis that would provide some sense of what the auction results might have been under a willing seller design. And this is a little complex in the sense that the bid information that we have historically, those bids were developed under historical auction rules. So there is not an easy way to fulfill that request directly, but we're thinking about to what extent we might be able to provide anything that, if we're looking at the overall goal of what we heard from load serving entities, is they want to make sure that any changes to the auction structure would not limit their ability to hedge as needed. We're thinking about how we can find some way to provide that. So we don't have an answer yet to exactly what that data is going to be in methodology, but we're trying to think about how we can address the goal there.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it would probably also be really beneficial to look at, sort of the LSC overfunding that has occurred, like the cost allocation of underfunding and how that has occurred in the pocket of dollars there. I mean, yeah, I think that there's a lot of potential analysis that could be done there to basically, that I think clearly demonstrates the benefits of competition. But I think the other thing we should really look at is, just basically the discriminatory treatment that is currently occurring because of the underfunding, and how to resolve those issues and get better pricing and get better dollars back to load.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Doug Boccignone. Go ahead, Doug.
Hi, this is Doug Boccignone for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. Thanks for sharing this slide. In terms of the undue discrimination, I do think it's worth digging into that in this stakeholder process. And because what we're talking about here is putting limits on people's participation in the auction. And, there's already limits that are put on people's participation in the allocation process. So it's not a new concept to limit the ability to participate. So that's the, and what we're talking about is using people's demonstrated use of the ISO transmission system to develop metrics for how much they could bid on in the auction, similar to like where there's SEQs in the allocation process. And our proposal would be use the information that the ISO has, which is schedules, day-ahead market schedules.
Thank you, Doug.
And I do still see a hand up for call-in user 9. Did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, this is Noha on behalf of ETAG. And yeah, I wanted, this question's really for Doug to elaborate on the limitations or what rules are limiting participation when it comes to the allocations.
No, I mean, so allocation participation is already limited based on historical load, which is a metric that's representing the historical use of the transmission system. And what we're suggesting is that the auction participation also be limited in some fashion based on the historical use of the transmission system. And because, this idea that CRRs are the financial equivalent of firm transmission to us only makes sense if the parties who are acquiring the auction CRRs are actually using transmission. And if, to the extent someone's using the transmission, then they have a need for a hedge. That's the concept.
But that, well, I mean, there's two issues with that. One is, I mean, that does fly directly in the face of FERC precedent on competition, which is one of the core tenets of them organizing these markets. That's why I think like we really should delve into that issue more and make sure that everyone is on the same page on what's legal and what is not. And then the second aspect of it is there is already a core limitation in the CRR auctions. I mean, that's what's causing this underfunding, is that folks that are using the transmission system should be paying for it. That's why the loop flow issue is one of the main causes. That's separate from allowing people to be a counterparty in the CRR auction and provide pricing competition and transparency in the space. And you know, like if you're hedging, you need people on the other side of that. So I think that's a separate discussion. There should already be a limitation on the amount of capacity that is offered, which I think is maybe
there
there's a
is.
disconnect here.
There's the capacity in the system. I mean, you mentioned loop flow. I mean, one of the problems of the current system is the loop flow isn't modeled, and so we end up, you know, potentially releasing more CRRs in both the allocation and the auction than really should be released.
No, it's that it's not that we're releasing more CRRs, it's that we're not charging people that are looping through the system. So there's not enough revenue to pay out the CRRs.
Yeah, but we're not going to address whether loop flow should be priced in this CRR enhancements discussion. I mean, that's
that is
just
exactly what we're addressing with revenue adequacy.
I'm sorry?
That is exactly what we're addressing with the loop flow issue and revenue adequacy.
If I can step in.
No, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I mean, I think expanding the footprint of the ISO market and having more people participate in the day ahead market will price in the impacts of the loop flow caused from those transactions, but it won't address loop flow from other markets. So, and I don't think anybody has proposed. I mean, people have talked about putting limitations, you know, and this is more in the EDAM CRR discussion, but it goes beyond EDAM. You know, I mean, I think anything we can do to model expected loop flow impacts would be beneficial, because it will change the amount of CRRs and the pricing of the CRRs in the auction. But yeah, well.
Yeah, I mean,
I'd like to.
I think that's why we were. Yeah, I'll go ahead, Hillary. But I think that's why we were paused for so long, so we recognize this issue has far broader implications, and it came up in the EDAM process. But go ahead, Hillary.
I appreciate the discussion, because this is a great example of how many layers there are in this. So if I can try and distill a couple things here. On the one hand, it is true that our definition of revenue adequacy and our revenue adequacy outcomes are certainly influenced by the amount of congestion revenue that is collected. And you're right, Noha, that is affected by the broader conversation around how congestion is charged. So it is true that is relevant to our revenue adequacy outcomes. At the same time, you made a good point, Doug, that what we're considering in the scope of this initiative is how we can improve our revenue adequacy within the CRR construct specifically. And one thing I want to note is, if you're going to be talking about congestion management and pricing beyond just the CAISO BAA, that's also a different stakeholder group. And that's part of why we try and separate those conversations, because that conversation is being had in congestion revenue allocation, where we're making sure that everyone who would be affected by that is included. Of course, we have a large stakeholder group here, but it's part of the reason why we separate those. So that is why it is so important that we pay attention to the regional conversation and the CRA initiative as we proceed here, because we want to make sure we're accounting for any changes there that would impact the amount of congestion revenue that is being collected. But we're not deciding that here. And it is true that within the scope of this initiative, I think one of the most direct thing we can do on loop flow is to try and make sure that we're modeling it such that the amount of CRRs that we release is going to be accurate to the amount of congestion revenue we're going to have to pay out to CRR holders so that we minimize our chances and severity of revenue inadequacy under the framework that it exists. I hope that I addressed both of you, and if either of you have further comment, welcome. But there were a lot of layers there, so I'll pause there. I think the two of you are still first in the queue, so if anyone wants to respond, feel free.
Looks like their hands were lowered. So next we'll go to Justin Penu. Go ahead, Justin.
Hey, so I think conflating the limits placed on allocation and the auction is probably not the right metric. And the reason I say this is, if we go back to the contract pass method, when you reserve transmission, you're basically or network transmission as a load serving entity, you can only reserve up to your forecasted amount. Here, we're sync bound in our allocations, and it's not necessarily true that the past allocations are based on your physical positions. They're based on your past selections. Or based on the past LSC selections, which may not have anything to do with what their positions may be. And if you go back to contract pass method, there's no limitations on point-to-point transmission because your contracts and your future contracts and flows do change, and you need the ability as an LSC and a generator to be able to select new paths without being bound to historical restrictions.
Thank you.
Next in the queue, we have Bonnie Blair. Go ahead, Bonnie.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. I work with the Six Cities Group. Going back to NOHA's reference to precedent, I would find it very helpful if I can't recall the group represented, but if the specific references to precedent could be included in written comments. I'm not aware of any FERC precedent that requires the customers that pay the costs for the transmission grid to support payouts in the hundreds of millions of dollars to market participants that don't use the transmission grid. And in my view, FERC precedent very consistently refers to the purpose for CRRs as providing a hedge for use of the transmission grid. And to the extent there are asserted to be benefits from participation by financial participants, then those benefits should be quantifiable and should be commensurate with the profits that the financial participants earn. And so I'd like to have the opportunity to look closely at the precedent you're relying on.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Next in the queue, we have Doug Boccignone. Go ahead, Doug.
Hi, Doug Boccignone for BAMX.
I think Partha had a question.
Oh yeah, let's go to Partha first before we take your question, Doug. Sorry about that.
So thank you. I was going to add to Bonnie. This was discussed. I think this was included at a high level in our earlier our original paper. Laid out a lot of the FERC precedent around this. Obviously, it's not like there's not crisp answers to all the questions. I think that also ETI in their comments, I believe, had some of that precedent. But I was just going to note that for your reference, Bonnie, if you want to go back and review it. But yeah, appreciate your feedback.
Thanks, Partha. Next, we'll go to Doug Boccignone. Go ahead, Doug.
Hi, Doug Boccignone for BAMX. I just wanted to respond about the issue of, the particular paths that you might want, a generator might change. And I understand that, but the generator, you'll have data showing the generator's been injecting energy in the ISO grid, and that quantity, some measure of that quantity, whether it's peak output or volumetric over some period of time, could set a limit on CRRs that could be bid in at that source. And you could do similarly if you're serving loads somewhere or exporting somewhere. You could set some limits, and things will naturally evolve over time. And I don't whether it's backward looking or forward looking. I think the backward looking is probably easiest to implement. But there's probably other ways that it could be done. I think about like the out of balancing authority area load serving entity process, allows for BAAs who are not part of the ISO BAA to participate in the allocation process based on their demonstrated use of the grid. I suppose you could do something similar to that for the auction. So I maybe just one last point. So I think a generator or a marketer who, the data we looked at, there were a handful of auction participants who clearly were using the ISO grid. They were injecting energy or withdrawing energy or both. And they also participated in the auction. It looked perfectly reasonable to us. But there were, the vast majority of the auction CRRs are held by market participants who don't schedule any energy transactions in the ISO. And what we're proposing would address that. And I think we should have the conversation about whether that's consistent with FERC policy or not. I think it is.
Thank you, Doug. And I'll just note that the analysis that Doug referred to was from a presentation in a prior meeting in this initiative. So you can find that on the initiative website if you'd like to review it.
Thanks. And next we have call-in user 9, who is, I believe, Noha. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Noha again on behalf of ETI. I just wanted to respond to Bonnie's comments. We not only provided written comments, we also, and if you go back to the recorded meetings, we actually had Sidley Austin do an entire presentation covering all the FERC precedent, and so did CAISO. They reiterated a lot of that. And you're absolutely right that there should be quantifiable benefits. One of the things we had asked for at the outset of this process is to have London Economics come in and do a study similar to what they did in both MISO and PJM. In PJM, they found that having financial participants active in the FTR auctions saves consumers anywhere between $500 million to $1 billion annually. And in MISO, they found that stage 2 ARRs would not even be funded without financial participation. So I concur with you. We should definitely have London Economics do that analysis. They're capable of doing it. They've done it in 2 other footprints. And the FERC precedent is certainly there, and it has been covered. So I urge you to go back and watch that presentation. That was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Abram Klein. Go ahead, Abram.
Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in on this issue as well in terms of, I was going to reference the ETI presentation, but it's really FERC Order 888, requiring transmission owners to offer non-discriminatory open access. Basically, if they're not using their own transmission, letting others use it. And it actually relates to the point that Justin brought up and also Doug spoke to, which is that the CRRs that are allocated to load serving entities based on historical usage are not necessarily the same CRRs that load serving entities might be using based on what their generation sources are today. And they're certainly not the same profile of CRR that generators need to hedge their output. So one of the big advantages in terms of liquidity in the CRR auction that's created, it's allowing entities that value congestion the most to, based on their bids, to get those CRRs and that match their own business needs, and it allows for a reconfiguration of the CRRs. So I think when we put on some of these restrictions, I think we will find that FERC has been very, I don't know, I don't think they think very highly of kinds of restrictions to open access, especially when what the California CRR auction is doing is allowing for that type of really efficient reconfiguration so that companies can meet their business needs. So I just think there's a real challenge to go, whether it's willing buyer, willing seller, or restricting participation only to participants who can demonstrate that they're physically in the market, even though market participants may be offering hedges or other kinds of financial transactions with counterparties in the market. All of those restrictions are going to have a very high hurdle in terms of getting approval if California decides to move in that type of direction.
Thank you, Abram.
Thank you, Abram. Next, we have Bonnie Blair. Go ahead, Bonnie.
Hi, I just wanted to respond to Noah. I listened to the Sidley Austin analysis at the time. I respectfully disagree with it. I thought it was sort of very result oriented. And in terms of the claim that the CRR auction structure as it currently exists allows for those who value congestion to procure the rights. If that were the case, there would not be hundreds of millions of dollars of losses from auction participants that buy CRRs or acquire CRRs for nothing or next to nothing, and then get huge payouts on congestion that nobody predicted. There's nothing efficient about that.
Thank you, Bonnie. Next in the queue, we have Torsten Keeper. Go ahead, Torsten.
With Pemex. Two comments. The first is I definitely encourage everybody to review the London Economics study, in particular the parts of that study where they're explicit that the findings from PJM are not applicable to the CAISO for reasons discussed in the study. And I would say too that it would be very valuable to study what these additional benefits that we keep hearing about are. Although no, we've actually only heard about one study, which is this LSE study. You would think that there would probably be more. These benefits were really durable and demonstrable. Additionally, with respect to the open access question, our proposal at BAMAX is designed around the goal of ensuring open access to people who use the transmission system. And indeed, that is what open access refers to, right? It's open access to the transmission system. So I challenge any of the entities who are making windfalls in this process and who have no apparent use of the transmission system to explain what benefits they are providing to this process themselves. And I would also request that maybe some entity other than London Economics, or in addition to London Economics, studied this for the ISO. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Torsten. Looks like we have one more hand raised. Follow-up question from Noha. Go ahead.
Yeah. Just regarding the Finley presentation, there was nothing to disagree with. It literally just went through the FERC precedent. They weren't arguing anything. They just said, here's what the orders said, full stop. So I'm not, so maybe you disagree with FERC, in which case you can take it up with FERC, but that's fine. And then the second piece about open access is open access and competition. It is open access to the transmission system to people that also do not own transmission, so that we can have pricing competition. And that's just like Avram said, this is Order 888 and Order 890. And you're right, those LEI studies were done in MISO and in PJM, and so that data is applicable to PJM and MISO. And we simply asked that a similar study be done by them. It's not like there are a million consultants that can do this kind of analysis. That's why we suggested them. It's the same reason MISO picked them after PJM picked them. You know, is that they're a neutral party. They don't have any skin in the game, and they just look at the data and they provide the data, and they work with the ISO on the data. And there aren't a ton of studies on this because they're very expensive to conduct, and that's why. But there also aren't studies the other way. I really haven't seen any demonstration. And as far as Bonnie's point about, you know, people are buying CRRs for next to nothing and then congestion happens, there are also, you know, the opposite of that, where congestion goes negative on people, the reversal that Avram was referring to. And then they're providing a service of providing the value of that price to whoever the hedger might be on the other side. So, you know, contracts, these financial contracts go both ways. And so I would urge you to look at that data as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Looks like we don't have any other hands. Oh, we just received a hand from Steve Keen. Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, Steve Keen, Edison. The last point that was just made, that it can go both ways. If that's what you want, and you know that's really what's going on, then you should be perfectly happy with a willing buyer, willing seller, because you can take positions on either side then. So, you know, you don't have, you're not kept out of the market. You can take positions on both sides. You can be up and down depending on what happens. That would give you exactly what you just said was going on. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Looks like we just received more hands online as well. First up is Torsten Keeper. Go ahead.
Hello, thanks again. I just wanted to add that there are a number of other entities that are capable of doing this kind of analysis, and they're often employed as market monitors for those other ISOs. And typically they do not seem to be telling the same story as London Economics. Thank you.
Thank you. Next in the queue, we have Bonnie Blair, and then I think that's it for the questions. Go ahead. Oh, and then we also have Jordan Miner in the room afterwards.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the the characterization of what Sidley and Austin presentation did was just say what FERC said. They provided their interpretation of what FERC said, and that's what lawyers do. I don't criticize that, but to suggest that there's some that presentation constituted a definitive reading of FERC precedent, I think is not accurate. And it ignores again the consistent and repeated FERC language that says CRRs or financial transmission rights are supposed to provide hedging, and similarly, order number 888 said that you provide open access under certain conditions and assuming full payment for the use of the transmission system. Order number 888 didn't even require financial transmission rights. It satisfies open access if you have physical access to the transmission system. They've required or they've expressed a preference, at least, for CRRs in organized markets because there's an attempt to accommodate the market framework with an ability to provide hedges. And that's very different from an assertion that the transmission system should be open to financial speculation, no matter what the cost, and that the customers who pay to have the transmission in place are somehow required to backstop that speculation.
Thank you, Bonnie. Next, we have a question in the room from Jordan Miner. Go ahead, Jordan.
Hi, Jordan Miner, CPUC. 2 points I want to make. In our prior comments, we pointed out that in California, due to the CPUC with the IFT process, that is all centrally planned. So we don't really take into account the price signals coming from the CRRs. So that's one point. And then the second point is that DMM did very extensive analysis in the last round of comments. I'm trying to replicate part of the LEI study that I would encourage everyone to read. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. One final question from Justin Panu. Go ahead, Justin.
It's Justin here. I think, as you know, we've pointed out, we're an LSC and direct access service LSC in multiple markets, as well as a generator. And everything we see commercially is in line with the LEI report. So, we're able to hedge to the load aggregation point with lower risk premiums and PJM. We're handcuffed in the ISO to provide those same hedges. I understand that you're not as concerned about it as, when you're a cost of service provider or an LSC, but you should be, but I guess you're not because the risk premiums don't really matter. But, they do increase cost to the ratepayer. And, all we can say is we have commercial experience and we're in these markets all the time. And the benefits are there if structured properly. And that, in our position is if you have BOP-style auctions and have a way to improve, and there are a number of improvements that can be made to auction efficiency and revenue adequacy together, provide a hedge that is meaningful. And as we've stated before, we don't provide hedges to the DLAP here in California, but we do so in in other markets that have a proper option, auction structure that allows the ability to do that. So that's all I've got.
Thank you, Justin. And I'm not seeing any other hands in the queue. Jordan, was that a old hand? Yeah. Back to you, Hillary.
Moving on then to our final three components here. So our next one is on auction pricing, and specifically the idea of some kind of minimum transaction price. This is something that came up in some of the scoping phase conversations as a measure that could potentially help address the revenue, the auction efficiency item without going as far as a full structural change to the auction design. There is some precedent for this in other ISOs, but if this route were to be considered, there are two major things that we would have to look at. One would be the methodology. If there were going to be any kind of minimum transaction price, what should that look like? What would it be based on? What is the methodology? So that would be a significant part of any consideration of this direction. And then also, we would want to look at what impacts would this have potentially on auction participation and hedging ability? Because the first bullet point there, a minimum transaction price could, all else being equal, increase auction revenue and thus auction efficiency. The all else being equal is operative there, and we did hear some perspectives on that in the scoping phase. The idea that a minimum price could potentially impact auction participation, and therefore it wouldn't be the same. It wouldn't be necessarily looking at the same auction outcomes, but with more revenue. So we would want to think about, if we were going to consider a minimum transaction price, what is the appropriate place to set that? And as we're thinking about that, are we cognizant of the whole range of impacts that it would have, and confident that that would on the net lead to an increase in auction efficiency to the best of our ability to anticipate? So that's auction pricing. Not seeing any hands. I will move to the next section, which is relevant to your comments just now, Justin. So let's talk here a little bit more about the auction schedule and frequency. We've got balance of planning period structure. This, as Justin pointed out, this came up a number of places in the scoping phase, and the design of this structure is that we have a number of other ISOs that allow, in addition to the year ahead and month ahead auctions that the ISO uses currently, they also allow each monthly auction to transact CRRs for all of the remaining months in a 4-season structure. So for each monthly auction, you could transact potentially CRRs from the next 4 to 1 month, depending on how far into the season you are. So what we heard is that the interest in this is driven by a desire to have opportunities to rebalance CRR portfolios in the time frame between year ahead and month ahead, and that this would allow the CRRs to fulfill their hedging function more efficiently. So we recognize that there is interest in this. Considerations going forward, we would want, this would be a significant change on the ISO's side. So we are looking at, and would have to look at what that would mean on the ISO's side, but also we want to hear from stakeholders about what that would mean for your participation. It would provide additional opportunities for portfolio rebalancing. It would also increase the complexity of participation. And so we're interested to hear, is that viewed as a net improvement to the system? It sounds like for at least some of you it would be, but ongoing conversation. And I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. That's the second bullet point. So we recognize that there's interest in this. We need to look more into what it would mean for the system on a technical level. And also we're interested in feedback on whether that additional complexity is balanced out with increased hedging value, essentially, from being able to rebalance portfolios more often. Also, if there are structures that kind of capture this principle of being able to balance between the year ahead and month ahead structure, but you have ideas on some structure other than just 4 3-month seasons, that is something that we're also open to. So we would be interested to hear your feedback on both the value of this directional move in general, and also if you have specific ideas on the best way to divide it up. Not seeing any hands. Oh, sorry, I had one more slide here just about elaborating a little bit on the number of stakeholders who brought this up in the scoping phase. So we had interest and points made about increasing liquidity in the market, which could help improve price discovery and the potential to improve convergence between the CRR and day-ahead markets. And finally, we have our last topic here, which, as I mentioned, is not fundamentally an auction efficiency topic, but is grouped here for today because that link was made in the scoping phase conversations by stakeholders who viewed what they saw as lower bids in the auction than might otherwise have been the case, because in their view, the CRR1B methodology increased the uncertainty around CRR payout and therefore reduced, in their view, the hedging value of the CRR and lowered the bids in the auction. So we recognize that there are stakeholders who see a connection there. And so to that extent, if we were going to consider changes to the shortfall allocation, we would want to make sure as we go through that, we are thinking and getting feedback on how the CRR1B methodology has or has not impacted hedging ability for physical market participants. And we want to hear about what, in stakeholders' view, has changed since the adoption of CRR1B, or what about the impacts has been different from anticipated since the move in that direction was made. And I know we heard some feedback earlier today that there are perspectives that the impacts have been different from anticipated. We also heard from stakeholders in the scoping phase who viewed this allocation methodology as a very important improvement to the CRR framework. So there are a lot of elements to this one. And we want to make sure that to the extent that anything is proposed by stakeholders in policy development, that we're considering all of these angles. So this brings us to the end of the auction efficiency section. And just to summarize, this was the area that we saw really the most divergence in stakeholder positions, both on what specifically to do, and in some cases, whether anything needed to be done at all. And so we recognize it'll continue to be an area of rigorous discussion. We may also see, as we go along, we recognize that we're working in parallel areas at once. So we can look, as this initiative goes along, whether we need structural changes to the auction, or whether there's connection between what's being done on the revenue adequacy side and the auction outcomes. And finally, we got to this already, but we are looking at how we can address the outstanding analysis requests related to consideration of auction structure changes. And we do welcome any additional input at the beginning of the policy development phase here around analysis that stakeholders feel would be important to inform these conversations. So I'll pause there. We have reached the end of our material. I think if we have any questions or comments on those last two segments on minimum transaction price or the VAP auctions, that's welcome. We can also give anything from auction efficiency more broadly. Open floor.
I'm not seeing any hands in the room or in the chat or on the online queue. Giving it a couple minutes.
Give it a beat.
Yeah, still Still not seeing any hands.
All right. We covered a lot of ground already. Well, moving on then to next steps. So first of all, thank you everybody for your discussion today and your engagement. We appreciate we covered a lot of scope today. So thank you all for your participation. We are going to take one single set of written comments on these two papers and today's discussion. So you will see shortly posted a comment template that will cover all of those. Those are going to be due on February 4th. In terms of next steps, we're working on developing our schedule of upcoming milestones and timelines for these areas. So that will be forthcoming, and you will see an opportunity in the comments. If there are topics that you would specifically like to devote additional meeting time to, that is welcome. So there'll be an opportunity in the comments to speak to that. And finally, on that note, we really had, as you heard referenced many times today, some great stakeholder presentations in the scoping phase, and we very much still welcome additional perspectives in the policy development phase. So if there is something that you would like to present on or a specific policy proposal that you would like to make, we very much would like to continue that pattern of having presentations where there are willing volunteers. So feel free to follow up if you have any time, if you have ideas on that. And we look forward to hearing your written comments and also to, and to working on policy development. We appreciate this initiative covers just a huge number of topics and aspects of the market. And so we really appreciate the opportunity to work with all of you on this. Do we have any final?
Yeah, looks like we have a question in the room from Chris Steven. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, hey, sorry, I stepped out for a minute, so apologies for bringing us back after the next steps. But I just had one other topic that maybe hasn't been talked about a lot here, and I was just curious, if the ISO staff has talked with any of the, like engineering, planning, operations engineering folks about the impact of planned outages on the revenue inadequacy issue at all. And I could expand on that a little bit more, but I'll just leave it generally if you kind of understand what I'm getting at.
Well, let's see. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, sure. So for instance, other regions have a lot more robust timeframes when you have to put in planned outages. Some of them are 90 days, 6 months, a year in advance, depending on the type of outage. CAISO is a little bit more flexible or perhaps lenient on when they can be put in and when they can be accepted. I think there's instances that we have observed, this is Chris Devon from Calpine, that we've observed where there's been outages that may impact this revenue adequacy issue because they come in after the modeling of the CRR time frame. So that would perhaps be something that maybe could be discussed in this initiative. I'm just suggesting that if CAISO hasn't had those kind of discussions internally, perhaps we would like to have those here. Or, it may be a broader discussion, something for like the CAISO's operation and planning team to talk more about. And perhaps this isn't the right, scope in this initiative. But I think since it could, at least in our observation, impact the revenue adequacy in the CRR market, I think it's worth at least a little bit more consideration here. Thanks.
Thank you. And I'll note that we're early in the process here, but we do recognize that when we look at sources of divergence between the CRR model and the day-ahead timeframe, that is one of those. So I think, so broadly speaking, the representation and management of outages as pertains to the CRR model is something that we welcome further input on. And if others have perspectives on that, please do put them in your comments.
Yeah, Jeremy Malekos again. Earlier in the slide deck, Hillary had mentioned the possibility of us looking into inter-month changes or making model changes later in the process. You know, we have the tier 1, the tier 2 in auction. And the goal there in what we are looking at is trying to get those late change outages into the model wherever it lands along the path. So I think that's one of the things that we're exploring. It has its benefits, it has its drawbacks. I think that's something that we want to bring to this group as like how do we deal with that? But outage management is I'm hoping that we can bring that in to this stakeholder process also.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So I'll just follow up and say I think perhaps that's a better option than trying to make the rules for that outage planning more restrictive, like in some of the other areas. So if we could get those outages into the model, intra-month, like you're saying, or more frequently update the model, then I think that would probably be a good solution or something to explore that maybe would be more acceptable for both like the PTOs and the CAISO operations folks to still have flexibility to allow for the maintenance, but then address the inadequacy issue. So thanks for that. Yeah, appreciate it.
I think transparency is also good there also. So the reporting is probably something that can come along with that. But yeah, thank you.
We do have a question. Seth Cochran, please introduce yourself.
I'm curious why, along the lines of transparency, I'm curious why you still pause your outage postings between the model build for the CRRs and the time that the bid window opens for a given auction. It doesn't make sense because the whole premise of that was people could take positions on elements that may cause underfunding, but underfunding is directly allocated now. So like, why do you still do that?
Thank you, Seth. Sorry, I'm thinking in real time here. That is something, I think that fits well into the category. This won't be a direct answer to your question, but I think that fits well into the question that we would like to get comments on about how being able to make intra-month changes to the model would affect the market participant experience. And so I hear you that it sounds like in your perspective, the use case here has changed. And if that's the case, then we should take that into account.
Yeah, so I was just going to clarify, you're asking about the outage blackout dates?
That's right.
Okay. Can we respond to that offline or like in comments? Because I think we need to go back and look at that and figure out the history on that so that we can assess it. But
that's fine. We can do that. I mean, I'll tell you the history because I've been doing this for over a decade. The history is
thank you.
People could see that an outage wasn't going to be actually in the model, but it would come in after the snapshot. So then if they took a position on that, it could create shortfall. And so the DMM wanted to have the blackout dates so that people couldn't do that. But now that we allocate the shortfall directly to the people that have positions on a particular constraint, it doesn't make any sense. So that's where we are. I'll submit comments on it.
Thank you for that.
I see what you're saying. Thank you. Yep.
Not seeing any other questions coming in. So did you have any other next steps points to mention, Hillary? Otherwise, I think Brenda was going to mention an announcement slide before we wrap up.
Nope, that concludes our discussion today. So
thank you, Hillary.
And over to you and Brenda.
Thank you both, Hillary and Christina and Jeremy, who's there in the room for the ISO. And thanks for those panelists that have participated in helping us out, and also Partha. We wanted just to quickly share the Energy Blog Matters that was posted last week. provides the stakeholder input at the heart of everything that we do at the ISO. We also help shape policy as well, refine the business practice manuals and technical groups. So with all this information, we do have that exciting new visual that we present in the beginning, as well as those best practices that we're planning to continue within our stakeholder process. And as well, we have posted up the newly 2026-2028 policy initiative roadmap that involves many of these initiatives. So we also have kicked off that 2026 market policy development phase as well. We will be doing the infrastructure 2026 market policy planning as well going later this month. So we do have a lot coming forward, and we appreciate everyone's participation as we continue doing the notices. And we do have a handful of meetings. Tomorrow we do have the storage design and modeling half day in the morning, and we do have a market sync EDAM DAME going on in the afternoon to accommodate for that. And then next week we do have a market performance and planning forum in most of the day, as well as an EDAM benefits methodology afternoon at 2 p.m. So we do have a lot coming up, but we'll be working with everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email at brendamarquez@kaiso.com for the CRA Enhancements project. If not, we look forward to providing you more emails or more notices on the upcoming meetings. I can go ahead and pass that to Ahmed to close our call. Thanks so much.
This event has concluded. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.